Welcome to the Tenet Podcast. We're happy you chose to spend some time with us this week. I'm Todd Pearson here with my friend, my partner, known to some as quite possibly the most interesting man in the world, the eminent Wes Brown.
Hey, Todd, how you doing, buddy? It's another week.
It's another week.
I'm excited for this interview. Can't wait.
Too.
All right, let's get right to it. How about it?
Yeah. We have a fantastic guest this week. He is a curator of contemporary art who works across international borders to support cultural work that contributes to a more equitable world. He writes about art, he teaches art, and he serves on not-for-profit boards, on juries for awards and fellowships, and on advisory committees for cultural projects. He advises on both public and private collections, and on top of it all, he is an artist. Welcome to the program, Dan Cameron.
Thank you, Todd. It's really great to be here.
You know what? As soon as our good friend Dan Drossman started talking to me about you, I was like, yeah, I'm all in. I definitely want to get him on. I was not familiar with your work or you as a person, I got to admit.
There's no real reason you would be. I mean, it's not like curators aren't really movie directors or TV news anchors. It's sort of a niche profession in a way. I mean, the word curator gets thrown around a lot, but in fact, we're people who do it, for a living. It's a pretty small group. We all pretty much know each other.
I was curious about that. I would think that it'd be a pretty close collective of people, and that you'd, if you're working on these international exhibitions, that everyone kind of knows each other.
Yeah, it's a pool, I would say, of it's always a growing and shifting pool. And as in a lot of art related professions, the younger generation, the generation coming up, is much bigger than the generation, I consider myself part of. But that's the same in everything. But we do, I follow the work of curators who are 30 or 40 years younger than me, and they follow my work. And that's an interesting age gap that doesn't really seem to exist in the art world at all.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is there a specific thing that you have to do to call yourself a curator? Can anybody, I'm a photographer, I'm a working photographer. I've been to photo school, to art school, but no one has ever asked me if I have a degree in photography. In my 26 years of doing this, no one has ever asked me if I have a degree in photography. And I don't think people care.
They don't. I think photography is one of those areas in which it's so broadly defined that you're judged on the basis of your product, of what you produce. If people look at what you make and they see it as being credible or even really good, then they embrace you immediately as a photographer. But the contemporary art world is a little bit weirder that way, in that, I, for example, didn't go to curatorial school because there was no such thing when I was studying. My career starts in the early 80s, and the first curatorial studies programs didn't begin until the 90s, when it became sort of much more common. So people that got in the curatorial field did it by self-definition. Like you either glommed onto a museum staff and tried to work your way up the ladder, or in my case, you just sort of found yourself compelled to make exhibitions, and you just ran around looking for opportunities to make exhibitions. And you just kept doing that and doing it until, eventually you got to a point where somebody gives you an opportunity to do something in a much larger field, a much larger environment. And that happened to me a couple of times in the early years of my work as a curator. And suddenly I found myself making exhibitions all the time. And I think that's when you sort of realize, oh yeah, there's a world of people who do just this is what they primarily do, as their vocation. And once I found my fellow curators, I was really thrilled because we could sit around and talk about the issues that we share and the kinds of conflicts we come across, and really have a camaraderie.
So are you mostly curating museums or big galleries, or what does your curation look like as far as facility?
I curate almost anything. I don't really curate in spaces that I don't really feel a connection to. But as I mentioned to you, just as we were warming up right now, I'm doing a couple of exhibitions back to back this coming summer in a 19-story skyscraper designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in the prairie town of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And that's normally not the sort of thing that I would say that an aspiring curator would say, adds constructively to their resume. But I'm actually in another place right now in terms of my curatorial objectives, and partly doing things that are out of the way and out of the ordinary and unexpected is what I'm most interested in. That's kind of what I'm committed to now. Along those lines, I just got back from Chile, and my latest project is to convert a 200-year-old wooden former chapel that's in the middle of a field on a farm in a rural corner of the island of Chiloé, which is off the Patagonian coast of Chile. And we're converting that into a contemporary art space. That's my big project right now. So I'm kind of interested in defining how art can happen in unexpected environments without ceasing to be art. I mean, I think a lot of people feel like you can't take art in its purest form and bring it out to the country and say, hey, everybody, take a look, this is hanging on our walls. But in fact, you can do that. And so I'm really sort of exploring how that works right now.
And I think I read that they were going to tear that building down for firewood, right? Originally, or?
The chapel, well, it was bought as firewood.
Okay.
By a man who was intending to use it that way. And the owners basically gave him what amounted to about $10 more than he paid for it. He was like, okay, sure, fine. We'll just drop it off on your front lawn. And for the last 7 odd years, the family has been saying, we're going to use that space. That's going to be the exhibition space. And in Chile, if you have a space that's ready to roll, it's pretty easy to get public funding for it. But the phase of doing the in-between, weatherproofing it and restoring it and, solar power and lighting, all of that, that takes some time. And it's not easily fundable. So I kind of stepped in. This was my 5th trip to Chiloé, by the way. I kind of stepped in and said to this family, who by this point I knew pretty well, I said, well, wait, so all you need to do is get it fixed and you can fund the programs. And they said, yeah, pretty much. And I said, okay, I'm signing on. This is my new job, is getting it from the state it is right now to the state where it's exhibition ready. So it's in the middle of nowhere. And that's one of the things that I find super appealing about it. At the same time, I'm organizing an exhibition for the Paris Museum in Miami that opens this coming December. And it's a big, proper, large museum right in the middle of the Art Basel Miami Beach. So I'm not dissociating myself from the museum framework, but I'm just kind of over on the other side, testing these other areas that are, to me, a little less explored.
That's amazing. I love that. And so, you said there wasn't really a place for you to study curation when you were getting into that. So how has curation changed in the past, 30, 40 years?
Well, you can get a graduate or postgraduate degree in curatorial studies or curatorial practice, I think is what NYU offers. I mean, there have to be 30 programs like this internationally, and maybe half of them are in the United States. There's a couple in Canada, quite a few in Europe, especially England. But the United States demographically churns out more people with advanced degrees in curatorial studies than any other country. And it's a little bit like MFAs in the sense that it's sort of flooding the market. I feel like having entered the field at a time when there were no degrees, that really worked to my advantage because I could just invent what I was doing. And now with the professionalization of the field and specialization of the field, I would say, it's a very narrow sort of gooseneck, a very narrow pipeline that curators can pass through to enter the museum or not-for-profit exhibition system. It's not you're going to wind up, as often as not, getting a desk job at a gallery or getting a desk job at an auction house, which is, in fact, the last thing that a lot of these these students want, or would-be curators want. But in the end, you wind up wanting to be in the art world enough that you're willing to sort of accept a job that's not quite what you wanted, just in order to be able to sort of maneuver and get a better job along the way.
And then, just out of curiosity, then, in, let's say, Alfred Stiglitz's time or Peggy Guggenheim's time, how was curation looked at then as compared to when you were kind of starting out?
Well, there were no professional curators then. I mean, what you would have would be someone like a Bernard Berenson, who was, a great art historian and most of all, a great connoisseur. And Bernard Berenson would do your collection for you. That would be if you wanted it in your house or if you wanted it in your museum. It was sort of, it didn't really make much of a difference, whether in what framework he was working. It was more or less the same job. Now, that kind of practice could only happen during a window of time, let's say the Gilded Age until after World War I, say, when there was both a lot of newly minted millionaires in the United States who wanted art to sort of legitimize their social status. And there was also a surplus of minor masterpieces, let's say, or secondary masters floating around the European market that were available for, let's say, pennies on the dollar in some cases. And so there was this rapid transfer over a 30 or 40 year period of fine art objects from Europe, from the old country, to the United States, to private homes and museums. When I entered the field, what we had was like Henry Geldzahler. I don't know if that name is familiar to the general public, but he was quite well known in his day because he was this New York City commissioner for cultural affairs. He was a close friend of Andy Warhol's. He, for a while, sort of started the contemporary art program at the Metropolitan Museum. And he was this sort of dashing figure who gave really good interviews. And you could invite him on the Dick Cavett show. You could invite him on, and he would spend half the time explaining what it is a curator does. But because he was Henry Geldzahler, it was fine. It came off, very smoothly. I looked up to a different generation of curators that were more, I would say, exhibition makers. They weren't overall connoisseurs. They were people who were interested in the exhibition as I would almost say, as a device of provocation, where you're trying to make the case for art as an advanced form of cultural expression. And one way of doing that is to defend something that at first appears to be indefensible. Because art always has that, not always, but it very often has that threshold issue where, the artist makes it and everyone steps back and goes, what did you just do? Are you crazy? And then they get attacked all around by critics. And then a generation passes and people say, oh, it's a masterpiece. The artist, he's a genius. It's sort of happening right now with Charles Ray. And you get used to this. I mean, it's just sort of something that happens in the art world. But I guess if you grow up, as I did in the age of Andy Warhol, you start to understand a little bit how the exhibition becomes both an opportunity for art nerds, art freaks, to get their fix, and to make the case for some sort of an argument in defense of art as an important cultural practice, where you're saying, art is not marginal. It's not about decoration. It is vital to our lives. And I, as a curator, I'm going to show you how, if you will just follow me, into room 1, where we have blah, 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 blah. And that's how that's how I grew into the field, was just trying to construct exhibitions that were trips, that were literally voyages that you took, and you were supposed to come out at the other end a changed person. and you do that as a curator because that's what happened to you. It's a lot like a concert. You remember exhibitions where you were just blown away, and you just spent months afterwards mulling over that experience you had. And once you get that bug, you want to create that same sort of experience for others. You want to transport people from the realm of the normal every day into the realm of art at its most engaging.
At what age were you when you got that bug?
I was 19. I actually, it's funny you mentioned Stieglitz. I grew up near Lake George, and I'm from the Adirondacks originally. And so our summer jobs in high school and college were in Lake George. And I was aware of David Smith. That was I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Smith. He was a post-war abstract sculptor who did a lot with welded steel. He was sort of a real, butch veteran guy who just took these massive pieces of steel and iron and welded them together and changed really the direction of American art. But one summer when I was working there, somebody opened something called the Lake George Arts Project. And I was a student at Bennington College, so I had some familiarity with the history of modern art in the Lake George area. And so I showed up at the door one day and I just said, I'd like to volunteer here. I'd like to, just do whatever you need to be done. And then in short order, they found out that I was interested in making an exhibition. So they let me make an exhibition. And I sort of never looked back. I went back to Bennington that that fall, and just kept bugging the secretary of the arts department for the keys to the gallery, to the Vapid gallery, so I could sit in there and look at the blank walls. I mean, that was sort of what I was into right then. I was just like, well, and that's a lot what a curator does now. You sit in an empty room or empty series of rooms, and you look around and you try to envision the exhibition you want to make. And I found myself asking over and over again if I could organize a show. Can I put a show together? You're not using the space for a little while. Do you mind if I use it? And it was just, I became an annoyance to the art department secretary, so that she just made me a set of keys and I could just go in and out whenever I wanted to.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So once you graduate college, did you make your way to New York City?
That's exactly what I did. Yeah. I was fortunate to have a couple of high school friends one of whom was in theater and one of whom was in publishing. And that was our goal: move to New York City and meet Andy Warhol. It wasn't so much go to Studio 54. It was go to New York City and meet Andy Warhol. Of course, that was the time of punk. That was really a thrilling moment to be, especially in downtown Manhattan. The club scene that was going on, the graffiti scene, the burgeoning years of hip hop, that was all part and parcel with being in the downtown art world in the early 80s. So I had a bunch of jobs, but it was always about maneuvering my way into a situation where I could A, make exhibitions, and B, write for a living, which I realized I could do at a certain point, that I could write for magazines. And then I proceeded to quit my jobs in succession of time and just try to stretch out this independent curator gig as long as I could, with a patchwork quilt of, sometimes I'd be working a dozen jobs at a time, both writing and curatorial. But, I lived downtown in a cheap apartment. So just getting by at that period of time wasn't as much of a challenge as I think it is obviously now for anyone moving to New York or any big city in the United States.
Was there anybody specifically that kind of took you under their wing early on that kind of helped you in this journey?
Oh, a lot of people did. The most important person at that period of my career was Marcia Tucker. And Marcia Tucker had founded the New Museum, which is still around 30 odd years later, almost 40 years later. She was a curator at the Whitney Museum who famously supported living artists. And she got fired over an exhibition that she did that was very controversial at the time, and of course is now considered a classic. And she just said, okay, fine, I'm out of here. I'm going to start a museum for living artists. So the New Museum was born at the end of the 70s out of this rejection by the mainstream art world. And Marcia had done a number of shows that put the museum on the map, the most famous of which was called Bad Painting. And Bad Painting is still remembered today as sort of a turning point in curatorial practice, where she founded a new generation of artists who were trying to take the ideas of Philip Guston, take this idea of kind of clunky abstraction and merge it with serious post-minimal abstract painting. And it really was happening. And Marcia had her finger on the pulse. And so she named it bad painting because the artists were sort of consciously refuting certain principles about what a well-made painting looks like. And most of them are still important artists today. But I just remember being at Bennington and the painting faculty was off the rails with indignation over this show. And how could this woman do this? And how can a space calling itself a museum, do a show called Bad Painting? And of course, the Clement Greenberg years, which were still somewhat dominant, were all about quality. It was all about the perfect painting, the painting that is the essence of the painting. And meanwhile, Marcia's doing this thing called bad painting. Well, I just wanted to go work for Marcia. So I did what I did in Lake George. I showed up and said, can I fill out envelopes? Can I volunteer? Can I lick stamps? What do you need? And within a fairly short time, she was inviting me to make a proposal. And I made a proposal about doing an exhibition of gay and lesbian sensibility in contemporary art because, here I was, out of the closet in my early 20s and living the life in New York City. And it seemed like so many people I knew and met and talked to were gay, and that gay culture and identity seemed really prominent, and yet no one talked about it. And obviously I knew why, but I just said, I don't mind doing this. I mean, I'm young. What do I have to lose? And I proposed it to the museum and they said yes. And so right away I got to do an exhibition. It wasn't bad painting, but it was an exhibition that kind of put the idea of sexual identity in the forefront in how artists identify themselves. And it was a turning point in certain ways. And I kind of, boy, did I get hooked after that, because, we had seminars and we had panel discussions, and some people were upset by the show and other people were disappointed by the show. And because I was really young, some people were resentful that I had done the show. And so I kind of found myself thrust into this public discourse. That was exactly what I wanted at the time. I just wanted to be part of something that people were invested in, that people had put their energy and their beliefs into.
And this was in 1982, is that correct?
I made that show in 1982. It's 40 years ago. Wow. And it'll be 40 years ago this year. And then, of course, AIDS just came along and knocked a lot of that discourse out of the water.
It became a whole different conversation, I guess, with the whole AIDS
sexual revolution. Just boom, it was over.
Yeah,
and everybody was sort of recoiling from that.
And no one had done a show like that prior to you doing this. Is that correct?
That's right. And to me, it seemed like an obvious thing that needed to be done. But then a lot of people told me at the time, Dan, you're never going to work again. That you don't understand. This is a Pandora's box that you do not want to open, because if people are closeted, there's a reason. If people prefer to keep their sexual identity secret, then they have their own motives for doing so. And outing people was a phenomenon that came along much later. So the negotiations for the exhibition were really very delicate, where artists would say, well, I don't know if how much I want to be public about it. I have this body of work that isn't gay, but I have this other body of work that's more homoerotic. So why don't you just show the homoerotic stuff? Because, artists who sort of pulled out after saying they would be part of it, and artists who said they didn't want to be part of it because they didn't want to be showing with a bunch of other homosexuals. I mean, it was really, you had a lot of internal homophobia within the community that was kind of about, no, I'm not going to be dragged into this. So it was an incredible learning experience for me as well, because in the end we made an exhibition, and it's known as the first of its kind. So if I could go back and do the exhibition again, it would be a totally different exhibition, obviously, because everything that came along happened. And I ended up working with a lot of artists later who I didn't work with at the time, who were also gay, whose lives were profoundly transformed through AIDS. But I did that when I went back to work at the new museum as their senior curator in the mid-90s.
So it was really like the perfect timing for this. You probably couldn't have done it a number of years earlier. And because of the AIDS epidemic, you probably couldn't have done it a few years later. Am I right? Or am I missing the point there?
No, that's exactly right. I think that people were ready to talk without being super uncomfortable about gayness in art and the sexual identity of artists. But it was baby steps. And my idea was that, there is such a thing as sensibility and it comes through. So our loophole was that the artists in the show didn't have to be gay. They simply had to express a gay or lesbian sensibility through their work. And lo and behold, oh, well, they're all actually gay too. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the sensibility that comes through their work. So there was a little bit of, dodging, and weaseling out of a certain rhetorical predicament where people didn't want to say, I'm gay, therefore I make this kind of art, or I'm lesbian, therefore my art looks like this. When in fact, in many cases, that is what they were saying, but in private studio visits.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so cool. That's awesome.
It is. It's incredible. And it's visionary. And, Wes asks this question quite often to artists, but, what does it mean to be bold? And, that was pretty bold at the time, not allowing other people to infiltrate your vision and carrying it out, seeing it through. I mean, that's bold in my book.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that I do have a lot of chutzpah. I mean, I don't deny that. I think I can come across as sort of the warrior, just sort of forging my path. But I'm really more invested in the idea of the experience for the viewer, in that, for me, art has this ever reinforcing capacity to create profound reactions inside of us. And I want that experience to be kind of cranked up to 11, if we want to take the Spinal Tap analogy. And I feel that works best with the unexpected, when you don't know what you're walking into. I mean, a few years after the New Museum exhibition, I did an exhibition in Spain. It was my first exhibition abroad. And I was supposed to be doing an exhibition about the East Village at one institution. And that got sort of sidelined. And then another institution run by someone who turned out to be a great friend of mine. You asked before about mentors. The other mentor of mine at the time was Maria de Corral, who ran a program in Barcelona and Madrid at a foundation called La Caixa. And I was super interested in Spain and all things having to do with Spanish art. And so I had already been to Spain and done a research paper article about the art scene. And Maria knew about my East Village project and said, if I asked you to do that project today, like a year after you proposed it got sidelined, would you do the same project? And I said, well, no, actually, because the East Village of the early 80s of Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring and that scene, that's kind of already fading. And there's this new generation that's come out that's more interested in pop and conceptual art, like Jeff Koons and Chaim Steinbeck, Peter Halley, people like that. And they seem more aligned with this earlier kind of pictures generation of Sherry Levine and Barbara Kruger. And so Maria said, well, if I gave you a space and a time slot in our exhibition space, which is a very prestigious space in Barcelona, would you want to do that show? Okay, how about I invite you to do that show? And I said, sure. And so that, again, was at a time when this was breaking news in New York. It was really very early for this generation. But since I had the opportunity, I said, well, I'm not going to show audiences in Spain yesterday's news. I want to show them art in the moment of its transformation, when there's a precedent shift, when something changes. So I took that risk and it worked fantastically. The show was a big hit. It was called Art in Its Double. And it was so successful that it then got moved to the Madrid space and gave me a platform to work independently in Europe for pretty much the next 10 years. I had just a rolling series of invitations. simply by introducing European audiences to this material before others. So for me, the idea was, oh, I'm just going to make the most exciting show that I can. And for others, it was like, who is this guy? Like, and let's get him to do something in our space. So I've kind of bounced around the art world in that sort of framework. After Katrina in New Orleans, I was very engaged in New Orleans, and I have been for, since the 80s, when I stopped making music myself and just became a music fan by experiencing music the way that they experience it in New Orleans, particularly at Jazz Fest. So after Katrina happened and New Orleans was devastated, very famously, people were calling me from the art world there and asking me if I would get involved, if I would be part of the cultural rebuilding of New Orleans. And, those are the words that you sort of like wait for someone to ask you. At that time, I was sort of transitioning out of the new museum and thinking about other ways where I could expand my work. And within a period of just a few months, that turned into an idea where, we would launch an international art biennial, contemporary art biennial in New Orleans while it was still in the period of rebuilding itself. So rather than wait for everyone to sort of fill in all the gaps and clear it up, and in particular, rather than waiting for all the museums and exhibition spaces to get back onto their pre-Katrina calendar, we decided to sort of come in and say, all right, if we launch this big international show that we think will bring in, actual art groups, like art tourists, which heretofore was not an existing commodity in New Orleans, but we thought, there is an art scene there. There are local artists, and people in the art world felt like, how do we help? How could we be involved? How can we contribute to the rebuilding of New Orleans? And I was like, I'm doing this. This is how you can be involved. Come to New Orleans, see this exhibition, be part of New Orleans, be part of redefining the city instead of making it a site for a disaster. We as the art world are going to join in together and create a definition of New Orleans as a city of recovery, as a city that is redefining itself through contemporary art. So that was another way, I guess, where I just, saw this situation. And I thought, I'm like the guy whose only tool is a hammer. Every problem I see is a nail. You just have to whack it with a curatorial, project, and everything solves itself.
I think what's really interesting, just from the little bit we've talked, is what sets you apart from maybe other curators, or what makes you successful, is that you have this vision that comes to you, or you're able to see this transition that's happening. And instead of just what I would do is I would wait it out just to see, am I right? But you're like, I think there's a transition, or I see this vision, and you just jump at it. And then you're hammering the nail right on the nail. I mean, you're hitting it right on the nail, right? I mean, to use a kind of a mixed metaphor there.
I feel like, I look at artists, and, artists take this world. Who is it? Douglas Huebler, the conceptual artist, said, the world is more or less full of objects. No, the world is full of objects, all of them more or less useful and acceptable. Why do I need to add more? And I think every artist asks themselves a version of that question. Like, why is it necessary for the world to have my objects on top of all the other objects that are already out there circulating in the world? And I guess it's that starting from nothing and then making something, like coming up with a complete self-sufficient, for the sake of argument, art object that holds its own. That whole process amazes me. I mean, I sort of stand in awe of how that necessity takes shape, because the artist isn't usually saying, well, I'm just doing this to mess with people's heads, or I'm just doing this to make a buck. It's a deeper compulsion. And I guess I mimic them. I find myself looking for a way of thinking about a situation as an artist would, like that I'm thinking about my curatorial work, not as if the curator is an artist, but rather that the curator works in service to the art. And therefore, the closer our decision-making can resemble the decision-making that artists go through, the better the results are likely to be. I don't think that's really a tried and tested idea, but that's the closest approximation I have of it in my head right now.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you've been doing your entire career, right?
It is. It's how I sort of get up in the morning and find myself, facing all these sort of different projects and challenges, is by sort of approaching it as artistically as possible.
Even in that extended sensibility show, it sounded like even early on, you were trying to engage your audience beyond just art on walls, because it sounded like you put together programming in conjunction with that exhibition. So it sounds like you try to engage people in multiple ways and give them the full experience. Is that correct?
You do. And at the bottom of all of that is the idea that you're trying to get people to believe that art is important. That's always the struggle, because I think in our culture, too many of us have kind of grown up with the idea that art is sort of a marginal activity, or that it just doesn't matter as much as other things do. And I've come around to the belief that art matters as much, if not more, than most things in life. So when you create other activities, when you're doing panel discussions and trying to provoke, or if not provoke, but try to engage people in a conversation, the idea behind that is that they'll find something in their own lives, something going on in their head, or some aspect of what they're going through, and the art can speak to that. But they often need they need a little, just a little point of connection, somebody to just sort of talk about the work, to talk about how they relate to the work, because we're in a culture now where we're bombarded by images all the time, and they're always moving, and it never stops. And when you're talking about artwork, you're saying to someone, here's this one thing, it's on the wall, and it's not going to change. It's just going to stay there. And you should go up to it and, take a deep breath and kind of center yourself and engage this thing that's staying exactly the same the whole time you're standing in front of it. And that's really hard in our society, to get people to do that. And the only way I think you can get them to do that is to believe that there's something that will make sense in terms of their own life, in terms of what their already existing priorities are. And you can't do that in a questionnaire. You can't do that, by running a survey. You just have to sort of fish for it, or you just have to use yourself as the example. Say, like, I see this and I feel this way as a result of seeing this. And sometimes just hearing that, just people going like, wait a minute, he really means it. He really is feeling this when he sees that. It's a kind of a permission, like he doesn't seem to be crazy. Maybe I can start feeling things, in front of artworks too. And that's what you want. That's the state of engagement, or potential engagement, that you want people to be able to open themselves up to.
Yeah, you got to engage and relate to them on some kind of level. And once they see that, it opens minds and changes minds, right?
Yes, and you have to work with art that you really believe in. I think that's really what it comes down to as well. You have to really be deeply committed to the artist or the artwork. And in many cases, what I like to do is I like to commission works. I like to, like the project we did in Kansas City a few years ago, we had literally the entire park system of the city of Kansas City at our disposal. And we commissioned about 18 public artworks, many of whom were in Swope Park, which is huge. It's 3.5 times the size of Central Park. And to be able to have a budget and have a proposal, and then sort of create an interface between the artist and the site and the budget and the materials and the technicians, and make a new piece, in a public space where people could be driving by and they have no idea that they're about to encounter an artwork, or, those sorts of opportunities are the most satisfying, because then you get to tell the story of how the artist thought it through, because you were there, you made it happen. And honestly, people really love hearing about artists working. It's so fascinating that, they may not feel that warmly about an artwork, but if you tell them about the human being that made it, and their journey and how they came to that, then you've really you've got them where you want them, because then it's on a human to human level with just an artwork in between as the interlocutor.
Yeah, it's that human connection that we're all striving for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, is the thought behind art in America different than other places in the world, like Europe or South America, where you spent time? You talked about how art is not necessarily looked upon as being a necessity. Is that more of an American thought, or does that happen all over the world?
I think it happens in the New World, if I could put it that way. I think in the Americas, we're a little more prone to thinking of art as dispensable. And I think that has to do with our history of colonization. I've never really quite gotten to the bottom of it, but as Americans, we still tend to look to Europe, let's say, for validation. Like when it comes to art or opera or certain art forms, the Europeans know better, and they may not know better, but they certainly have a different commitment to art as an essential part of a civilized society. And in Europe, for example, museums tend to be almost fully supported by the state. And there's a whole lot of discussions that we could have about that topic. But, in the United States, we depend on the private sector to support our museums. And, your museum is functioning economically as well as your relationship to the board members go and the different foundations and funding organizations that you're involved in. That takes a lot of time and bandwidth for an American museum director, whereas in Europe, a whole lot more time is spent with substantive issues, let's say, how programming goes. So this whole idea that Europe looks towards artists differently, I think, is borne out. And I think that's one of the reasons why American artists have historically drifted to Europe, at least for a few years of their life, so they can immerse themselves in a culture where that is the case. One of the reasons I like working in South America is because their experience is very similar to ours, where, you think of yourself as a frontier people and a people that sort of built up a country, sort of together. And art was always marginalized. Art was, art. I think Teddy Roosevelt very famously announced that there were no artists in the United States. That simply was not going to happen because we were a different kind of people. We were cut from a different cloth. And I think that's still part of our heredity, of our inheritance, I would say, as a people. And just coming back from Chile, as I did, there's it's hard to think of a society in which artists are looked at any worse than they are there, because they had a long dictatorship during which artists were considered the enemy of the people. And even though that all ended 30 odd years ago, they haven't really totally come fully around until recently to understand that the artists that fled, or the artists that were persecuted, or the artists that had to hide their work out of censorship, those were actually great citizens. Those were model citizens. Those were the people doing the heavy lifting of trying to restore a democracy back to a country. So it just watching how in Chile it's taken such a long time to see artists returned to a position of prominence and respect in society, that lets me look back on our experience in the United States and sort of think about how we look at artists and make fun of artists or put artists on pedestals. We do all kinds of perverse stuff, regarding the artists in our society, that aren't really necessarily connected to the work that they make. And I like traveling to other cultures because I like seeing it through their eyes. I'm also always looking for artists, as I know you can tell from the way I talk about it. So I'm always on the hunt. I'm always looking to see exhibitions and things, go to studios and find art that I can convey to other people. It's about finding the art and then getting turned on by the art and then finding a vehicle to share that art with the maximum number of people and saying, hey, look, here's another case in which art is important. And this may not come from your culture, my culture, but you can still relate to it. It's still eminently relatable because, art at its foundation, I think at its core, is a universal language bringing humanity together.
Absolutely. So in America, do you think art is looked upon more as a business as opposed to other countries or other parts of the world?
It's become that way. Yes. We've mastered the art of leveraging sort of art, the art market into sort of a commodity that's traded, in much the same way that stocks are. I think it's important, though. When I was growing up, art was always seen as a fraud. Like when they brought Andy Warhol on TV when I was a kid, it was always to laugh at him, because what the pop artists were proposing was so, antithetical to what society was supposed to be about at that time, that people just thought it was all a hoax. And I think that has stayed with Americans to a degree. I think this sort of deeply rooted suspicion about what artists are actually up to, that's kind of part and parcel of this other part of the art world, which is that, with so many artists descending on New York City, beginning, with the rise of Nazism and fascism in the late 30s in Europe, right up to 10 years ago. I mean, artists have just been coming to New York in such volume for so long that it's bound to have become not just a center of artists living, but a center of people opening up businesses that show art and sell art and try to get the art disseminated throughout the world. So there's, in my neighborhood, I mean, I could walk out my front door and there are no less than 100 galleries within a 10-minute walk, not a taxi ride, a 10-minute walk from where, and then spread throughout the city, there's probably another 200 more. These are businesses. They also are venues. I can walk into galleries for free and see art anytime I want to, which is one of the reasons I live here. We also have museums. We also have auction houses. So the monetization of contemporary art, which really started in earnest in the 1980s, right around the time that we're talking about Basquiat and the East Village and all of that, that was really the first moment where you had money coming into the art world, people investing in the rapid appreciation of prices, so that certain galleries, and rather not name them right now, but certain galleries were involved in jacking the prices up to like sort of having their clients in the auction, bidding things up. I mean, there's some dirty games that were played, and the speculation in contemporary art became it was just, they just had to light that fuse and suddenly it took off. And we've been on a bit of a roller coaster ride ever since, where you're sort of speculating in the prices of what we call the primary market when artists first showed their work, and then the secondary market when things are sold at auctions. That journey, that trajectory from primary to secondary market has become an all-encompassing furnace right now that just consumes billions and billions of dollars. And, it's there. There's no denying that that's part of the art world. And the United States being the kind of culture that we are, that seems to have created a little more respect. That seems to have garnered the art world just a little bit more credibility. Like, well, okay, if these really smart billionaires, are buying and selling Jeff Koons, well, there must be something to it, which conversely also, I think, raises the level of just general cynicism about what's really going on in the art world besides the speculation, if anything.
Yeah.
Do you think New York will continue to be the art epicenter in America?
Always. Yeah. I mean, not always, but yes, for the foreseeable future, because it's already rigged that way. I mean, if you have to have a center, and so far the way the art world functions, the art market functions, we do. It's New York. Now, if another city would appear to have a more appealing sort of culture or quality of life that they can offer artists, I mean, I think that that's always going to happen. The trick here is that you do not have to be living in New York to be a successful New York artist. We sort of basically say that you're a successful New York artist if you're showing with the New York gallery, and that gallery is able to place your work in collections and museums. So nowadays, artists can live pretty much anywhere they want, including not even in the US. But then New York becomes the market town. It becomes the place where people, sort of sell their work. LA is the producing town by comparison. There are fewer artists, but there are also about a fifth the number of galleries. So you have a preponderance of of LA artists, California artists, let's say, who show their work in New York, but don't have a local gallery because the market is in New York. And if they show in New York, they're more likely to sell their work. That's sort of the relationship. And then you have this thing called art fairs, which are sort of uprooted and they move around as these sort of pop-up experiences that last for a long weekend, where hundreds of dealers will show thousands of works. And that's sort of a phenomenon unto itself, where most people aren't even engaging with the work in a, let's just say, contemplative manner. They're not there to enjoy the work. They're there to acquire it, get it home, put it on their wall, and enjoy it, in their own time and space, which is, that I'm privileged enough to sort of have gotten used to the idea that whenever I see a work of art, I can just stop what I'm doing and take it in the way that I want to. But that's not what art fairs are for. It's, you kind of have to keep it moving all the time. I can't speculate on whether this is bad or good because it's so radically redefined how the art world operates that just keeping up with it takes enough of my own brain power, as opposed to just try to drawing some deeper moral or ethical lesson from it. I don't think there is one.
Do you have personal thoughts on people that just buy art for investment purposes?
No, because I like the idea that there's enough money flowing through the art world pipeline that artists I know are living well or stably. Let's put it that way. That they're not worried about where next month's rent or food is coming from. I mean, I think that that's a change. It's not available to all that many artists, and of course, it's very, very lopsided. There's always a very few who are benefiting, way out of proportion to everyone else. And that's as true in the art world as it is elsewhere in the system. But I just want people to be, if people are going to be buying art, I don't want them to be buying junk. I don't like the idea of millions of dollars being spent on art that really is designed, it's almost got built-in obsolescence, that it's almost designed to depreciate in value over time. And there is a sucker element to how the market is structured right now, so that certain people kind of buy into the same scheme, and they don't really understand that everyone else in the scheme is planning to pull out at a certain point and dump the work at auction without the last player knowing about it. I mean, it's not quite that rough, but there is a lot of insider sort of price fixing that goes on in the art world. And I think it's shockingly unethical, but I'm not placed as an insider in such a way that I'm actually able to do anything about it or affect it. I'm mostly concerned with how the repercussions affect me and the sort of work I'm trying to do.
Sure. That makes sense.
I mean, I don't buy and I don't sell. So it's a little weird to be caught up in this and to be observer and to have to be conversant and to sort of know who the players are and know more or less what's going on without having a dog in the fight, without having any skin in the game.
It's also a great position to be in too, though, right?
I get a lot of, I get to be a witness to a lot of things. And, some of them are entertaining as hell. And some of it is incredibly corrupt. But, at the same time, I do get this insider experience in terms of the relationship to artists, that many artists and I have a very, very good working relationship going on and a good dialogue.
Sure. You got a personal relationship with these folks, and that in itself has to be incredibly interesting and educational. Do you spend a lot of time? Obviously, you go out to galleries and see exhibitions at museums. Do you go to art fairs as well?
I don't go to many art fairs. I don't really enjoy them, but I mean, this past fall, let's see, was it this past fall? Yes. The Armory show came back to New York along with all the satellite fairs that go along with it. And I don't know if you know much about the Armory Fair, but it was sort of the local fair. It never really expanded to, multiple cities. It just sort of stayed in New York. And it was a little bit, how could I say? It used to be out on one of the piers, on the West Side piers. And it was just, the location was just disastrous. It was just always felt like it was just going to break off and float away into the Hudson River. It just had this kind of New York anarchy about it. And year after year, they would just do the fair. And then, of course, the pandemic brought an end to that. And so now the fair has moved over to the Javits Center, which is this sort of big convention center that we have, which was designed to host things like art fairs, only it had always been rebuffed. The art fair would say, well, no, we're perfectly fine over here on the pier, which hasn't collapsed yet. Thank you. But we're doing. And so they finally moved into the Javits Center, and I had to go. I mean, I had to just sort of show up and go from booth to booth and say hi to the people I knew, because it's a real effort for gallerists. I mean, for people to own galleries, you have to pay a lot to get into an art fair. You have to pay to move the work, to install the work. It's really a drag. And since these folks operate businesses that allow me to sort of just check in on what's going on in art on a monthly basis, I always feel like it's worth my while to stop by and let them know that I appreciate their efforts, even though I'm not really the customer they're after, but I'm there to help support it. And there's always social media. You're always trying to single out things and say to the people that, that follow what you're posting, hey, I just saw this. I think it's pretty great. Hey, I just saw that over there. It's closing on Sunday. Check it's up for another week. All of that, I think, is a way of being part of a conversation that isn't necessarily about business, but it's about disseminating artworks through, public media.
Yeah, it goes beyond your occupation, your job, right? You also feel this responsibility to, outside of your normal everyday activities, to help turn other people on to things that you've seen. I mean, I think we try to do that with this podcast, and, with our social media. You want people to go out and support artists and be appreciative of the things that the hard work that people are doing to facilitate art in the city that you're in.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I also feel that, again, because I'm always hunting for things, I'm always, operating with the assumption that just around the corner, I'm going to have some kind of an experience that could change my life or change the direction of my own work. And in that way, the research-based part of what I do is it's super exciting to me because of that element of the unexpected. You just have no idea how you're going to respond to something until you're standing in front of it and trying to get to the bottom of whatever it is the artist has done to put this thing in front of you. And you could just very well go home and decide to embark on some project that's related to something that you saw that day. There's always this possibility that the upheaval is going to happen.
I love that mindset and philosophy. I definitely share that. And that when I go out to look at work in galleries or exhibitions at museums, I never know what's going to hit me over the head, what kind of catalyst or what kind of experience or who I might meet. I mean, the sky's the limit.
And it doesn't look the same way. I mean, if you have a favorite museum and you go back to that museum, 5 or 6 times a year, including visiting the permanent collection, which maybe isn't changing all that much, you're going to respond to different works on different days. It's not just saying, well, that's my favorite painting over there, because maybe that day that painting is kind of closed to you. but in return, some other object is sort of opening up to you. I mean, while I was in Chile, I went back to one of my favorite museums there, which was the Pre-Columbian Museum in Santiago. And even though indigenous Pre-Columbian artwork from that part of the Andes isn't as well known, to sort of us in North America, it's a fascinating set of beliefs that go along with it. And one of their beliefs, and it's not that dissimilar to what some North American indigenous groups have believed, which is that the sculptures of people, the sort of ancestral figures, aren't objects. They are in fact beings, that they are animated, that they don't represent the life force, they contain the life force. And this gets down to, sort of how you treat the object. At the moment, there's sort of a dialogue opening up between the administration of the museum that has always sort of shown these ancestral figures above the ground, because that's what we do in museums. We show things elevated. And the Mapuche, the people from whom these works were obtained, have been saying all along, they need to touch the ground. Their feet need to be on the ground. They're in there trapped, and you're not letting them have contact with the earth. It's like you're just messing up with these people. And on the outside, you're sort of watching this sort of dialogue happen back and forth. And I guess what's going on now is the museum seriously considering repositioning all of those works, so that, in fact, when Mapuche visitors come to the museum, they'll be able to look at them and say, now that's how you do it. That's how our ancestors, should be treated. And I'm not an animist. I'm not promoting that particular belief, but I do feel that there's a level of enchantment that is possible in our relationship to objects that we sort of deaden ourselves to, that we think of objects in terms of our role as consumers and not in terms of our role as spectators. And I think that is often, I think, it kind of numbs us, I think, to the full range of responses that we can have to objects or phenomena or people or activities occurring near us, or that being more exposed to art, just like being more exposed to music, I think reawakens your sensitivity in other areas, in other sensorial engagements. I've come to firmly believe this, and sometimes treating objects as ancestors, might be a good like jumping off point for stimulating that sensitivity.
What is your fascination with Chile? What draws you to it? Why do you keep going back there?
I like how isolated it is. I like the fact that when I first went to Chile, I remember Pan Am. Pan American Airlines. Yeah. So when they were going out of business, I had, I think, 40,000 miles saved up. I had just enough to get me to either Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, or Santiago, Chile. And I remember going through this in my head, sort of saying, well, I know enough about Argentinian art to know that it's kind of likely that I might wind up there. And, Brazil is sort of, the center of South American culture. So I'm definitely going to get invited there at some point. But Chile, I was like, I don't know anything about Chile. I don't know anyone who knows anything about Chile. And if I don't get there myself, I'm probably never going to get there. So that's where I'm going. And it ended up being, I also, I'm from the generation that, that sort of lost its political innocence with the Vietnam War, where I was too young to be drafted, but I was old enough to know people, seniors in high school when I was a freshman, older relatives, people that were drafted. And I think as I came to be aware of what was going on in Vietnam and how unjust that struggle it was, that was when the coup happened in Chile. And so rather than being a war that was going on, and then I grew up in the midst of it, this was something that happened when I was already, let's say, awake. And just knowing that this country had democratically elected a president, they did exactly what democratic nations are supposed to do. And then we in the United States, in the person of the CIA, personally intervened to overthrow and kill that democratically elected president and install a military dictatorship that murdered thousands of Chileans and tortured hundreds of them and just destroyed families. And I guess I always felt responsible. I felt like, all right, I wasn't a taxpayer when that happened. I was 16 years old, but it was an injustice that just rankled with me. And I thought, I'm showing up in Chile in 91 for the first time. And that was only a couple of years after democracy returned to the country. So I guess I felt that by going there, I can see firsthand to an extent how a country moving from an authoritarian government to a democratic structure, how that feels, what that's like. And in the New York art world, we always knew of like one or two expatriate Chileans, who basically fled the Pinochet government and came to the United States as asylum seekers. And they really were very helpful in terms of letting me understand how to approach people, how to talk about these issues. They kind of warned me that it was still not something that people felt comfortable being public about after all these years of not being able to express your opinion politically on the street. And so I guess I felt that, in going to this country, I was witnessing something that wasn't simply, a place in time that was stable. Not that any culture was, but that it was very consciously in the midst of transforming itself. And I got kind of hooked at that point. I got kind of interested in how artists in Chile were making their work in the midst of all of this sort of transformation in their society. I also, I'm fascinated with cultures that are themselves isolated. Chile is one of the most geographically isolated countries in the world, because it has desert on one side, Antarctica on the other, the Cordillera on one side, and the Pacific Ocean on the other. I mean, it's cut off from the rest of the world. And I find that isolation weirdly appealing. I find myself drawn to it. And going to this island of Chiloé, which is at the margins of Chilean society, is even more fascinating for that same reason.
Do you feel because they're isolated that their artwork is different? Or is it similar to other South American or Central American countries?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're talking about, educated Chilean artists living in Santiago, who have graduate degrees in art, I mean, yeah, no, they're making a version of international art. I mean, there's obviously local variations, and there's a lot of political art coming from the period of the dictatorship that has come to light and come to be appreciated more, since that time. And I think for a lot of Chileans of, sort of my generation older, there's sort of this returning to a sense of normalcy about having artists in your midst. So a lot of artists who are in their 70s and 80s now are just getting known, to a general public in Chile and being celebrated. And it's not just artists, poets, of which Chile produces a lot. They are definitely being sort of embraced. And, there's a rock group called Los Prisioneros, who were sort of a punk group that sang pretty political songs at a time when it was not really safe for them to do so. And, there was a basic upheaval in Chile just a few years ago, which has resulted in them basically electing another Salvador Allende, another young left-leaning leader who's going to be inaugurated in a couple of weeks, if maybe it's next week. So all of that, suddenly the Prisioneros were everywhere. You heard their music on all the streets because people were taking these forbidden songs from 40 years before and embracing them as anthems, to be sung by all Chileans in the public square. So, just being on the edge of that kind of a transformation and being in contact with artists for whom it's very real and very vivid and who are making art about it, That's what makes my work so satisfying to me is knowing that, I'm in there with them, and there's a kind of a feeling of solidarity that comes out of that.
Yeah.
So let's circle back to this church that you're going to convert into a exhibition space on Chiloé Island. What needs to happen for this to take place? And is it going to be mostly like the local artists, a place for local artists to show? Is that the idea behind that?
Exactly. So the space is owned. It's called Comarca Contui. Comarca just means place, and Contui is the name of the region. And it's run by, friends of mine. Basically, the core family is the mother, the son, the daughter-in-law, and their child. So it's 4 people who live on this farm. And they bought it, I think, about 8 years ago. And they raise sheep, and they have geese, and they have sort of the normal crops. But basically, they have a cooperative arrangement with their neighbors who are all practicing agriculture or livestock in some way. Clara, the mother, is a sculptor. Pablo, the son, is a photographer. And so she has her sculpture studio, both inside and outside, connected to the farm. And Pablo has his darkroom in one of the side buildings. They also run a sort of an Airbnb artist residence because they have the edge of a river. They're on the sort of like the delta of a river. And the Airbnb houses are set into trees. They're what's called palafitos. The first time I went, I just dropped by to have lunch because people said I should check them out. And Marcela, Pablo's wife, is an extraordinary cook, like just extraordinary. And so we just happened to show up at lunchtime, and then lunch turned into a 3 or 4 hour visit, just chatting. And I left. That was several years ago. And I said, I've got to come back and stay. And then I went back a couple of years ago and stayed. And then I went back just earlier this month and stayed for 3 days. And the directions to get to Comarca Contui have always said that when you're going down this sort of dirt road, that you know where you are when you see the blue chapel. And that's sitting kind of out in front, just beyond the first gate. And that's when you see the sign saying Comarca Contui. So on this trip, we were with Pablo, and I was traveling with a friend and colleague who's an art historian, and we wanted to see Pablo's work. He basically took out from his drawers all of his photos, and his photography deals with traditional artisans and traditional fishing practices and traditional sheep shearing practices and traditional basket making. It's just what goes on in his community, what people do that's been passed down through generations that represent traditional lifestyles. And so he's documenting that through his photographs. And this is a very rural area. The nearest city is at least 30 miles away. And there's a few like rural schools with maybe a dozen students in each of them. So we began talking about what his aspirations were. And he said, I really do a lot of workshops. I did a Chilean photography meeting here, but what we need is a place where local kids can come and see what artists do, because they don't get any art in their classes. They don't get shown what art is. And traditionally, Chilote people from Chiloé, have produced an inordinate number of artists and people who are masters in certain fields. I mean, it's limited because of the materials that are there. But in order for that to happen, they have to see it first. So, in talking about how this was going to work, we asked Pablo, well, where would you do this? And he said, well, that's what the Blue Chapel's for. That's why we first got the Blue Chapel, to do that. But in the meantime, with the farm and the workshops and my photographs and Clara's sculpture, and, we just have not had a chance to do it. What eventually came out of that was me saying, well, if you had the space ready, would you be able to get programming funds? And he said, well, no, that's not a problem. We are in a region of Chile that is so underfunded that they are just constantly trying to get projects for us, trying to get project funding to us, but they won't pay for the stabilization of the space. They won't pay for the renovation. They won't pay for the weatherproofing. They won't pay for a solar panel. They won't pay for lighting. Nothing that has to do with prepping the space is fundable through public sources. So that's when I just said, okay, I know how to do this. I said, well, how much is this all going to cost? So we sat down with a legal pad and added it all up, and it came to just about $12,000 US dollars when you added the architect and all the work. And I thought, so for the lack of $12,000, you can't get this space up and running, because that would come out of, whatever the proceeds of the revenue from the farm. So we sat down with Clara and the whole family that night and said, look, I'm willing to do this. Are you guys all in? Because if I can raise the money to get the space ready and you can raise the funds to do the programming, we can come together to create a program that changes 5 or 6 times a year. And that's what we verbally agreed on. And then I launched the GoFundMe about 5 days ago, and we're more than a third of the way there. So it's been really a great spirit of saying, well, okay, as an American, this is something we do. We launch GoFundMe's and then bug our friends and relatives and say, come on, kick in $20, kick in $100. It's for a good cause. And, and then we sort of make it happen. So I'm being, the gringo in this case, where I'm sort of saying, all right, let me go back to my country and raise this money, and then I'll put it in your bank account, and then we'll talk about how we're going to work together. So that's one of a couple of different initiatives that I have going on the island that are kind of about looking at the artists who are there and trying to find a way to share their work with the public, because Chiloé has become very popular. And I think there are a lot of people who would respond to the work if they only knew about it or knew where it was.
You definitely sparked my interest. So for people that are listening and you want to support this mission of Dan's in conjunction with these folks on Chiloé Island, you can go to his Instagram at DJBC1956. Up in his bio on that page there's a link you can click through to the GoFundMe page. And as Dan said, they're about almost halfway, actually. I was looking at it today. You said 12,000, but I assume that GoFundMe takes their cut too. So you're trying to raise like 15 grand.
They take their cut, and we need a little contingency. We need to fund, give GoFundMe their cut. And I think the first couple of programs are going to come out of pocket. But to answer the question from before, so the first exhibition will probably be Clara's sculpture. Clara's 84, and she hasn't really had a show. And even though she's a strict atheist, she's actually been carving wooden saints for the last few years, I think in preparation for making the chapel into an exhibition space. And then another artist who's in his 80s named Guillermo Gres, who's just an incredible draftsman and painter, who's I've been visiting all these years. I always go back to his studio whenever I'm in Chiloé. So the first show will be the two of them, basically two octogenarians living in Chiloé, making work that really the community either knows about already or has heard about and wants to see more of. And we're just making sure that there's a stable place where they can go see it.
That's fantastic. So this Clara, she carves santos. Is that what they are? Kind of similar to what the New Mexican artists carve?
They're not. They're a little bit more Baroque. She's a trained academic draftsman. She made her living during the dictatorship, living in Baja California in Mexico, doing illustrations for scientific journals and publications. So she can draw a fish anatomically like perfect down to the last scale. And her approach to sculpture, to carving, is really to look at Gothic examples. Her saints tend to be very expressive. Some of them are in agony. Some of them are in a kind of a bliss. She has a beautiful Saint Francis of Assisi where, his hands are covered with birds, that are sort of playing with him as happened in the story of Saint Francis. And so they run the gamut of being sort of naturalist figures in a slightly romantic / primitive form to being almost grotesque depictions of. There's one of a saint. I don't know what saint it's supposed to be, but she's just enraged. Her mouth is open and she's howling in pain, and she looks Indian. She looks like a Mapuche woman. And we haven't had that conversation, but I have a feeling that we're going to get to that at a certain point, because the genocide against the indigenous Chilotes by the Spanish and later by the Chileans was a very rough chapter in Chilean history.
So in addition to continuing to curate big exhibitions like this one you have coming up in Miami at the Paris Museum there.
That's right.
In December, this is kind of like where you see yourself going, like these missions of trying to curate, you said different spaces, like almost like an outsider space of what people usually consider an art gallery or art space.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I think it has to do specific. In fact, it's becoming clearer now that what I'm after is a model for working with contemporary art in a rural environment. I guess I'm interested in that idea of advanced art on the farm. That somehow that this is possible. That there are very creative people living in primarily agrarian communities. And we don't really have in the art world a sort of medium for that work to be sort of appreciated and disseminated in an effective way. And so I guess in a way, this is a laboratory. Like, we're going to mix very avant-garde work with artisanship and sort of try to create an interdisciplinary connection to contemporary art, where, again, young people in that region can, on their own schedule, just stop by, and they'll know that 5 or 6 times a year it's always going to change out, and there'll be enough examples of different kinds of ways of making art and different kinds of creations that idea will get across. And eventually we'll be showing work by students as well. Another of the artists I'm working with in Chiloé, in fact, 2 of them are primarily engaged with working with kids. And so one of the distinctions that I'm kind of interested in breaking apart is art made by students as opposed to art made by professionals, and sort of how they can be put together in the same space so that people don't experience them as being on different levels of expertise, but they'll be on the same level in terms of their ability to communicate. So it's that sort of laboratory environment that I'm interested in developing here in the Blue Chapel.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you're doing this work.
With luck, that can maybe be transported to other places. I mean, maybe that model can then be applied in different sorts of environments. But there, because the land is run by artists and they already have this mission and they're already part of the community and people trust them, I feel like this is a good way to sort of see if we can make this work, see if we can create an experiment that will actually have some positive results for this particular rural community.
And use that blueprint to take it elsewhere.
Why not? I mean, I'm easily bored, but at a certain point, I think that, this can be certainly applied in different circumstances. Not all cities are the same, and not all farms are the same either. I mean, it's an interesting idea to think about in New York, in the United States, where we have where the polarization of our society in political terms is based very much on an urban-rural divide, which seems to be self-reinforcing right now, and so that's in the back of my mind as well. That the reason people feel a certain way is because they don't get exposed to enough art. It's I only have one tool principle, and what we just need is expose more people to more art.
Yeah, and that's what I think the beauty about this is that it does exposes a rural community to art that maybe they would never get unless they left and went to a more, I guess, a bigger community or whatever. So I think that's a brilliant idea. I think it's something that can truly happen and be engaging.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty determined to make it happen, and these guys are great partners. And I think, again, it's not just bringing art to rural communities; it's also recognizing the art that's already there. That finding the artists who are in the midst, who don't necessarily think of themselves as professional artists, but who are making work that if you showed it to artists, they would go, "Oh, wow, that's incredible! That artist is definitely one of us." There would be no professional distinction that would need to be made.
New Magazine is our media sponsor for the Tenant Podcast. That's NUE. You can follow both the national and the Denver edition of New Magazine on Instagram. The national edition can be found at new_magazine and the Denver edition at new_Denver_magazine. Look to New for compelling stories from the world of art and fashion. Thanks for listening.
I'm Dan Cameron, and you're listening to the Tenant Podcast.
Take a moment and talk about some of the other exhibitions that and projects that you've been really proud to be a part of.
Well, I think one that really means a lot to me was being able to do the biennial in Istanbul, Turkey, in 2003. I was working at the New Museum at that time, and I'd been able to go to two prior editions of the Istanbul Biennial, one in 95 that was organized by a curator named René Bloch, and then about 4 years later by a friend and colleague named Paolo Colombo. And I found Istanbul to be an incredible place. I mean, it's a very exciting culture and history, and the art scene there is very lively. And I was actually headed there. I was going to be leaving in 2 days when 9/11 happened, when the attacks in New York and Washington happened. And so, I obviously had to cancel my trip and send an email saying, I'm stuck here, and, got an outpouring from them basically saying, oh my God, it's horrible. We know. And several artists are there. And several people, just exchanging the usual ideas. And 2 months later, they wrote back to me and they said, we just had a meeting and we want you to be the first American curator of the Istanbul Biennial. So here I was in sort of this post 9/11 environment where, there's a lot of Islamophobia circulating, including in the chattering classes. And, I felt like, okay, if the most important Islamic democracy in Europe is willing to bring me, then as an American, this is something I really have to do. Well, so I accepted. And I mean, for better or worse, what was going on in the background between the time they invited me, which I'd say was January of 2002, maybe December 2001, right around then, and the time we opened, which is November of 2003, the U.S. launched its war against Iraq. So all of the stuff about weapons of mass destruction and other saber rattling and the preparations that built up to the invasion of Iraq was very much part of my daily diet of thinking and mulling over the subject. So, in collaboration with my partners in Turkey, I said, look, this isn't sitting well with me as an American. I'm really not comfortable with my country's foreign policy right now, and I don't know how explicit I can be. And they said, just try reflecting on it in a way that is the most poetic for you, the most sort of resonant without actually having to be explicitly political. And so I developed the title Poetic Justice as the theme for that year's biennial. And I kind of went for a certain level of awareness of a society that is on the verge of war, or that is slipping into war without its citizens knowing, that there is always this kind of idea of being on the verge of military action, and then how poetry can actually sort of be a force within that. And so that was really the thematic structure. And we sort of went throughout. I mean, I was interested in sort of going through the former Ottoman Empire, the countries that used to belong to the Ottomans way back when, and looking at the war in former Yugoslavia, which was still relatively fresh at that time, and trying to bring all those threads together and to talk about terrorism, to sort of work with artists who were based in Iran, who were not necessarily at all approved of by the government there, but also to work with Iranian artists as an American curator was its own kind of complicated thing. So in the end, I feel like I was able to achieve a balance where if you wanted to just experience that biennial on its artistic merits, they were all there. That I didn't think that the art was in any way lacking in terms of its just sensorial impact. And at the same time, if you were interested in seeing how the work was engaged with the political headlines at that moment, that was always there. That was always evident. It was this constant sort of drumbeat in the background of the exhibition. And of course, we invaded Iraq in March, and then we opened, just a few months later. So, the idea of being an American in the midst of this Islamic country and at a time that was very dangerous to be in the Middle East, that we, in fact, on our last day had a terrorist attack, a bombing of the British consulate, which was 3 doors down from where we were sitting at that time. And they ended up killing a bunch of people. And, I left Istanbul that day, kind of just seeing this wreckage of a terrorist attack behind me. And so I guess thinking about that in retrospect, what I'm happy about is that I was able to not disappoint, not sell myself short in terms of being an engaged citizen and trying to engage in civil dialogue about the direction of this country. In other words, that I was trying to actively engage my First Amendment rights, as an American while being on foreign soil and trying to do something that actually had to have the blessing of the State Department, in order to happen. So, it was a tightrope. It was really tricky. I mean, we were also dealing with the rise of an increasingly Islamist government under Erdogan, who at that time was a new president, and he'd been the mayor of Istanbul. So people thought, oh, how Islamist can he be? And then, over the next several years, we sort of found out where he was taking that government. But I guess being a curator in a public space like that, where you're expected to take a position, and to be able to defend the art that you're supporting with always making that reference to the political status quo sort of evident. I guess I felt like that was something I was super excited about being able to do. And it was a huge privilege to be able to do it. And I think the artists came away from it feeling like, wow, that was one of the more loaded exhibitions that they'd ever been involved in.
So was your artists that were selected, were they from Turkey or from all over?
They were from everywhere. They were from all over the world. I mean, we had probably 10 artists from the US and about the same number from Turkey. And then, the artists were from everywhere. They're from all over Asia, Southeast Asia. They were from South America, Europe, especially Eastern Europe. That's sort of Southeastern, Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian corner. That whole area interested me because, again, it was the site of the most recent warfare, dealing with the sort of aftermath of the Ottoman Empire. But they really Istanbul really brings in artists from all over the world.
That must have been amazing, and good for you for wanting to take that on and meeting that challenge. I can't imagine the complexity of that, and I didn't even think about the fact that the State Department had to be involved in some way.
Well, they did. They actually had to underwrite the travel of the Americans. And we went into a Kurdish region. Don't ask me why, but we were brought by our handlers into sort of a Kurdish area to talk about the biennial. There was actually a Kurdish artist in the biennial. And I guess at that point, the State Department said, yes, we'll do this. Yes, we'll pay for that. Oh, and by the way, we're also paying for this if you want to do it, meaning if you don't do it, you're going to seem like a jerk. So we did it. And it involved going to this Kurdish region and sort of giving a slideshow about the biennial and having a panel discussion with that Kurdish artist who was living in the town called Batman. I'm not kidding you. That's the name of the city, Batman, spelled like Batman. And, and then we went back to Istanbul. So I was really, I was minding my P's and Q's. And the American ambassador was fine up to a point. Like, he saw the exhibition and then he really liked it. And then he got like the second volume of the catalog, which basically was me writing about the buildup to the invasion and the sort of misinformation about Saddam Hussein and his capability of destroying the world. I don't know if this is a fresh memory for either of you, but it was pretty unbearable at the time. And I figure, like, I'm sitting, they're next door. I mean, this is next door to where I'm sitting. And I ended up writing about that. And that really pissed him off, but it was okay because I was long gone by then.
This pandemic that we're in, how has that affected you personally and professionally?
Well, it affected me personally in a lot of ways, because as a New Yorker, we went through the first wave. I lost a close friend right in the very first month of it, when we were all just sort of wondering how this all goes. A curator who was the same age as me. It was kind of one of these sort of shocking revelations that, like, oh my God, it's coming for me. It's coming for all of us. And all my work dried up. My husband's work, he works in the hotel career field, his work dried up. And so we kind of went from being active people to staying at home and getting, public support, getting unemployment insurance for a while. I think besides that hardship period, which I think many millions of Americans went through, I think it actually was good for me in that I reprioritized. I think a lot of people had this experience of just saying, like, all right, this is a good time to sort out the things that really are meaningful to me in my life and focus on them. And one of them was sort of, for example, understanding that my role as a curator involves sharing things, sharing art, and that Instagram can be one of those media. And when people were at home, not going out, I was going out. I was going to cities where their museums were open and sort of going, I'm sorry, I have art deprivation. I'm just going to hang out here at the St. Louis Art Museum until you throw me out because I just got to get my fix. And then spending a couple of days sharing that stuff online and saying to people, hey, look at this. And isn't this incredible? And, look at the German expressionists they have. And, just being very public about sharing art. And then after George Floyd's killing, there was a big thing in the Soho neighborhood where this is local lore, but while the big protests were going on in Brooklyn, the really big protests, on a Sunday night, there was a professional gang that went through Soho and in a period of about 90 minutes broke into and robbed something like 25 high-end boutiques and jewelry stores and shoe stores. It was very, very, very well planned inside job, which meant that next morning, pretty much every storefront owner in Soho put plywood up in front of their window, and so you suddenly had all of Soho, this at street level, being plywood. And I don't know how this happened, but it was as if a signal went out. And the very next day, young artists descended on Soho to begin painting murals. And they were doing Black Lives Matter murals and beyond Breonna Taylor murals and George Floyd murals, and just an incredible outpouring of creativity. And, I heard about this more or less through the grapevine on the radio. And the whole phenomenon lasted maybe 8 or 10 days before New York went into a different phase. I can't remember what all the phases were, but we were sort of open again, or restaurants were opening up again. So a lot of this plywood was coming down. And I immediately understood that my job as curator meant walking over to Soho, just going up and down every block, every street, figuring out where all the good stuff was, which were the best murals, document them all and put them all online. Because 95% of the people I knew, who I'm in touch with through, social media, weren't there. They weren't able to see it. They didn't know what it was, but I could, because I lived nearby, and I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through my fingers of saying, like, this is art. These are kids. Mostly they're all in their teens and early 20s. And some of them were making unbelievably great, powerful, messages through their murals. And I guess that sort of thing, that there was all this deprivation going on and all of this tension in the air. And yet I felt like, wow, no matter how bad things get, you can always count on artists to sort of move into a zone and say, wait a minute, we have a message, we have something that we want to share. We have images, we have things that we need to communicate. And these were activist artists, but as it turns out, one of the ones that I ended up documenting the most, who got the most likes, turned out to be the daughter of some friends of mine, but going under a completely different name and doing completely different work, in the streets. So it was really a fascinating way of saying, like, all right, what is the curator's role in a period of social crisis? What is it that we curators do? Do we wait for people to come to our spaces, which are almost impossible to run anyway in a pandemic, or do we go out and find it and then figure out a way to share it with as many people as possible? And so I guess that clarification happened to me through that particular experience.
That's really interesting.
I think there's a book out about these murals, or there's one about to be published.
Do you think this will be one of those definitive moments, this pandemic, in art history? Obviously, it's too early to tell, but do you think maybe in 100 years or so, if we're still here as a species, I don't want to be too morbid, but
you might be too optimistic.
Yeah. That people will look back and see fantastic art that was produced during this time because of this kind of shift that happened in the psyche of people that were stuck at home. And, artists were doing the same thing that they normally do, but they didn't have exhibitions or shows because they were canceled a lot of times. So they weren't under the gun. They weren't under pressure. And we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast, but I'd like to hear your take on that.
You might be surprised at my answer, but I think the visual arts is one of the areas that was least changed. I mean, I have a lot of friends who work in theater, and I have a lot of friends who work in music. And in both of those fields, the working life of the practitioner was so radically upended that literally nobody came out of it the same as what they went into it. And the difference with art is that so many artists work in isolation, and so many artists are home in their studios. They got the radio on, they have maybe the TV running, but the bulk of the art that they make is done without anybody else around. And so for so many artists, the pandemic was weirdly like an extended residency, in their own home, where what they wanted was more peace and quiet, and they got more peace and quiet. And so there is this weird disconnect between the world of the visual arts and the world of the performing arts, because, sure, museums were closed, programs were cut. I mean, a few galleries went out of business. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of downside in the pandemic for the visual arts world, but I don't think it can even compare to what happened to our colleagues in the performing arts, where I think for many of us, we were like, oh my God, we have to help, our folks who perform for a living, because they don't have anything to keep them going. I mean, fortunately, that's starting to change. I don't know how it is where you are, but in New York, we're starting to get back to a regular diet of, concerts and plays and opera and, all of those things. And I think everyone just feels like, wow, it's like manna, coming after a famine.
I agree. Yeah, you're starting to see that here in Denver. Things coming back to life, and then they just got rid of all the mask mandates. So it's the Wild West again.
I really want to come to Denver soon. I love Colorado, and I have friends who've moved to Denver in just the last few years. Not to mention people like Dan, where he's been there all along.
Yeah, you should definitely come check it out. When's the last time you were here?
I was in Denver about 3 summers ago. I do a lot of hiking, and so I actually I use Denver as a jumping off point to go to Utah. Sorry, that was the way it was that summer. I would have done more hiking in Colorado that year, but that particular year, I would just what did I do? I landed in Denver, did some work in Aspen, drove to Utah, hiked for several days, and drove back to Denver for a day and a half, and then flew home. But next time I'm going to hike some Colorado mountains, I promise.
I think it's always easy to romanticize different professions. And I'm sure people like to romanticize what you do as a curator, not realizing how much work, how much blood, sweat, and tears go into putting on an exhibition. What is the thing that people don't get about what you do you think?
I think people don't get that it's not a well-paying profession, but people want to do it anyway. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, I can't think of a circumstance in which one would become rich being a curator. I mean, there's no profit side. There's no, you can raise your fees, I suppose, and some curators have high fees, but it's not like you're not working in a marketplace. You're working in a very small field of sort of hyper specialists, some of whom are, if not indifferent to money, they just are sort of more interested in taking on projects that interest them than they are in sort of what is the more lucrative path, to take in a given circumstance. And I think that that's one of the things that people find a little confusing about the art world, because there's this assumption that with all this money floating around, that everyone who works in art is somehow magically endowed, with a trust fund or some independent income. And, that there's a little class confusion that can happen when, you sort of have to understand that people in the art world can be, they can come from the 1%, they can be people who have completely independent means, or they can also be working stiffs, who are kind of living from paycheck to paycheck, just like everybody else. But the field that they're working in happens to be the art world. And I think that sort of almost schizophrenia about class, which is endemic to life in the United States anyway, it's particularly exaggerated in the art world, where people kind of look and they're kind of like, well, if you're not rich, why are you in this field? We just always assumed it was just the children of the ultra wealthy who chose to work in art. And I think that's one of the biggest confusions that happen. And it comes up a lot in conversations, especially with artists.
It boils down to passion, right? It's a passion thing.
Yeah, I think most artists find themselves incapable of doing something other than what they're doing. And if there's just you really don't have a choice. I mean, you choose to structure your life maybe in a certain way in order to facilitate doing something, but the need to do something, the compulsion to do something, that's permanent. I think that's really something that all creative types share, whether they're writers or musicians, composers or painters. This sort of idea that if you leave them alone for 10 minutes, they're going to start doing that thing that they do, because that's what their mind is always turning to. It's like teenagers and sex. It's just, that's what your mind is drawn to. Like, oh, okay, well, let me just draw this out for a minute, or let me see if I can peck this out on the piano. You always have this idea of returning to the last little thing you were doing in your chosen field of endeavor.
Do you have a process that you go through when you're curating? What does that look like?
Well, my process usually starts with the space. I try to get to know as much as I can about the space. And like I was saying before, about being in these empty spaces and trying to imagine what could happen in them. I think that's pretty consistent with the way I work in all circumstances. I need to be able to draw the path of the exhibition, the path that you're laying out for the spectator to follow. And once I can kind of turn the space around in a way that I think works for the art, then it's just a matter of locating things. Then you try to say, okay, This person turns the corner and they come onto this wall. What is it you want them to see when they turn the corner and see this wall? So that there's all of this plotting, sight lines, what people experience and in what order and at what distance and what the lighting is like. You start to kind of try to finesse everything to make sure that the sequence works properly. But everything comes down to the space. I don't really know what artists I'm going to work with usually. I mean, unless it's already predetermined. But if I get to the space and I have a little time in the space, then I start being able to think about who it is that I want to work with. And I keep a very extensive file, obviously, of artists whose work I'm following. And sometimes it just helps to go through that list and kind of just trigger my memory. Oh, I saw that a couple of years ago, and I remember being really impressed. Let me go do some research on that artist and see what they're doing now. There's a whole lot of that process of just sort of like trying to surprise myself and come up with artists or combinations of artists that I didn't expect to see. So I feel like if I'm surprising myself, it raises the possibility that the viewer could be surprised too.
So do you maintain a database of artists? Is that how you go about it? What is your process of like keeping track of all these artists that you run across that you're like, oh, I really love what they do and I would like to revisit them, or I want to see if they would be great for this exhibition I have coming up in 2024 or whatever?
Well, I have a digital archive, which is just from carrying my phone camera around with me and documenting things that I'm interested in. But I also have a sort of a physical archive. I have an office upstate, about 200 miles north, which works as a studio and an archive and just a place to sort of be by myself, kind of secluded. And, there I have sort of physical archives. I'm actually hoping to give those to the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian, leave it to them, because I got really interested in the idea that we're living at the end of the age of printed matter, that things that get printed regularly are vanishing. There's no longer a common practice. So about 35 years ago, I started collecting everything that pertained to an artist's career that was printed, that was printed with an image of their work, to be specific. So ephemera related to exhibitions and alphabetized by literally thousands of artists is sort of this archives that I have going on upstate. I spend a few hours every month sorting things out and adding to the archives that I have. And if I go to an exhibition, a gallery, and see a show and there's a card on the desk that has an image of that artist's work, I take 2 and sometimes 3 with me and put them in my bag, and they go upstate and everything gets put into a pile, and then they get organized by artist. So I have files on living artists that are in some cases contain more extensive ephemera related to the career than they have. I once did a retrospective of the painter Peter Saul, who's 90 now, and I showed up at our first meeting with this bulky manila folder just full of 35 years of ephemera from his career. And I was like, Peter, what do you think of this? This is how big a fan I am of your work, is I've been accumulating this all along. And he was really knocked out that I had things that he hadn't seen in decades. And so that idea that the free thing, that the thing that has no value, that is always given away as sort of a sideline to the exhibiting process, that kind of thing fascinates me. So I have been sort of obsessively accumulating and filing. I have tens of thousands of items now, and I feel like that's going to be valuable down the line to some scholar who is going to wonder what this period was like in terms of all the ephemera that passed through the hands of people working in the contemporary art world.
That's really impressive.
It's a little nuts, but it's very gratifying. I mean,
but who else is doing that? I mean, that's really important what you're doing.
I don't think anyone else is doing it. In fact, Jerry Sauls gave me his archive, like 25 years ago. He's like, I'm sick of this stuff. I can't look at it anymore. It was when he and his wife were leaving the East Village. And I was like, how many boxes you got? I'll just take it all. And Yeah, I'm regularly folding other people's ephemera into my collection of ephemera. And that sort of leads me a little bit to my own studio process, which kind of grows out of ephemera that doesn't fit, like ephemera that doesn't have archival value for the Smithsonian, but I'm drawn to it anyway. And one of the reasons I went back to making art was I found that I had all these collections of items and images and fragments of things that interested me for their own reason, but I wanted to find a way to conserve them. I wanted to find a way to put them together into another form that would itself maybe be worth hanging on to, if that makes sense. So things that don't work in terms of the archive for the archive's sake very often wind up falling into this other area where I'm cutting things up. And, very often I'm accumulating, like when I was in Chile, I ended up buying a bunch of sort of weird, like Saturday magazines from the 40s that just had like really off the wall illustrations, just because they seemed really obscure and esoteric to me. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll just cut these up and put them in a composition, and then they'll live on in that form, that they'll have a life after this kind of life as a magazine that's that could otherwise be tossed aside, or that only has sort of marginal value. So I realized that it's a natural outgrowth of my own curatorial work, that I have I derive a lot of satisfaction from making collages and assemblages using all of this recycled quasi-archival material that passes through my hands, or that I wind up seeking out in flea markets and estate sales and junk shops and places like that.
How long have you been doing the collage work as an artist?
I did it regularly until about 1989. Right around the end of the 80s, around 1990, I stopped because I didn't have time. And then I thought, it's kind of weird if a curator makes art, and then you sort of have this sort of potential conflict of interest where you're trying to work with people who are, I don't know, it seemed loaded. And I just thought, I don't have time for this anymore. And I got a residency in December of 2016. I had been working on the board of a place in Florida called the Hermitage Foundation, Hermitage Residency for Artists. And when I termed out on the board, they said, oh, by the way, you've got 6 weeks free coming to you. You can take them, half and half or two at a time or all at once, but this is your reward for 10 years of board service. So my first residency was 3 weeks, and I went down with some writing, and I sent a lot of things ahead, and I found materials I'd been working with, and I found some old papers that I'd been collecting, and I just started cutting things up and arranging them. And then the next thing you know, I had gel medium in my hand and I was pasting everything down. And I realized that it was a little bit like riding a bike or not speaking French for 10 years and suddenly remembering you were fluent in it. That it was instantaneous. I was like, oh, wow, this really works. And it worked for me in particular in that I was still writing. But I found that if I was at my laptop and I was working on a text and I was blocked, then all I needed to do was get up from the desk, go over to the work table where I had all these papers and things spread out, and just immerse myself in that environment for a couple of hours. And at a certain point, it might occur to me that I suddenly realized what I meant to say back over when I was writing. And I could just go back and forth from these two environments. And then upstate, I've constructed a reading area. So when I'm not writing or making collages, I can read. And I find that one of those three positions is where I want to be on any given day. And I can do that for 12 hours at a stretch. So learning to be on a residency where I could essentially spend all of my time doing what I wanted reintroduced me to my own capacity, I guess, my own impulse to do this. I mean, I I was surprised, but I wasn't so surprised. It was like my subconscious was setting me on this path. So that once I went back to making collages, I would suddenly realize, whoa, I've always loved doing this. It's like something, it's not that I could have been doing it during those 30 odd years, even though I could have. And it's not even as if I consider myself a quote unquote professional artist. But I am exhibiting my work, and I'm a little squeamish, but I have a show coming up in Chicago in in June. And that's going to be a sort of a new horizon for me, is showing in a public space where there's someone promoting my work out there. But it takes a little time to get over the feeling of exposure. It's a little bit, like I can be a curator and it's my name and it's the work, but somehow I'm not in it in that way. But when I'm making art and showing it, it's kind of like being naked in front of a bunch of strangers. It's like, ooh, can I do this or not? Am I really going to be able to pull this off? Or am I just going to slink away?
Where is this show going to happen in June?
It's a space called Dime Gallery, and it's run by the eminent collage artist and writer, Tony Fitzpatrick. We've been friends for a while. He was in the First Prospect, New Orleans. When I first worked up the nerve to share a few collages online, basically saying like, hey, I've been doing this. I'm not sure what you're going to think, but he was one of the first people to say, wow, this is great. Show me more. And, I had an exhibition in Lake George last summer at that place that I went to when I was 19 years old, and I went back to them 50 years later and asked if 45 years later, and said, hey, I've been doing a bunch of stuff in the meantime, but how would you like to do my first show of my collages? And they got a big kick out of that. And I ended up showing it to like friends and family and people I knew from high school, which was exactly the right context for my first splash.
Right. Get your toe wet again.
Just one big toe, but yeah, I'm going to go full immersion next time.
Nice. So that was the Pictures Within Pictures exhibit that you did.
You were on my website.
And that was, I think I read or heard, that was like 60 pieces or 50 pieces. It was quite a few.
It was about 60 pieces. Yeah.
60. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to talk about a piece, and I'll pull it up and share my screen with you. I want you to talk about this piece. I really like this.
Oh wow.
Nice. When was this done?
Well, it's actually not finished.
It's not.
No, in fact, I think I have it in a later stage, but that's okay. This started. So when I was in Kansas City this summer of 2018, I would go to a lot of estate sales. And at two separate estate sales, I found this wallpaper, the shell design wallpaper. Do you see this?
Yeah.
Background. And I bought a couple of bottles of kind of cheap art class acrylic, but in kind of cute designer colors. And I also bought some rice paper. And this was owned by, I think, a woman who took classes in Japanese brush painting. So I had all this rice paper, but then some of the rice paper had these flowers on them, these sort of studies of flowers, chrysanthemums, I guess. So what I ended up doing was taking the sheet of wallpaper, painting in these sort of neutral areas with brown, and then laying over two different flower arrangements, one upside down on top of them. And then, these are a bunch of illustrations from different sources. These horses are from catalogs of vaudeville era, Victorian era advertising. A lot of these illustrations are from, again, like printed periodicals that are 90, 100 years old or a little older. The piece is named after this fragment over in the corner on the left-hand side. That's called Miss Luring in Her Tank. It's an illustration from from sort of a freak show that was touring the Midwest, in which Miss Luring could submerge herself in a tank of water for apparently long extended periods, and people would go and sort of try to interact with her. And I just sort of made this the kind of the weight on one side, and then began adding other images to it along the way. A lot of them seem to kind of capture scenes in the middle that are hard to explain or that don't have an explanation. Right here in the center, you see Dagwood. I don't know if you got a close-up of that, but there's Dagwood. He's on his way to the store. And obviously Blondie has told him that he has to keep repeating the word paprika to himself. Otherwise, he's going to forget what he was there for in the first place. It's just, typical Blondie and Dagwood thing. I wish I could show you the latest version, because then I went in over it a couple other times and added some other layers, which is one of the joys of not being a professional, which is I can just keep returning to these. I can let them sit around for months. And then when I finally realize, no, it just needs one more thing, I can just attack it and go back over it another time. So yeah, this has actually gone through a little bit of a transformation in the meantime. But those are the layers, the ones that I was mentioning before, the paper, this woman's Japanese brush lessons, and then the brown, the sort of cheap brown acrylic, and those three form the ground. And then these black and white illustrations go on top. And I guess I like the idea of trying to push something that's black and white into the foreground against something that's got colors, because it's not supposed to work that way. And then the fun comes when you try to make it work that way anyway, which I don't think I have done here, but this was an interesting stage in the development of that piece. But it's called Miss Lurleen in Her Tank.
I love it. It's really interesting, and it really is arresting.
Yeah,
thank you.
I love all the various parts of it, the illustrations.
I really like things that are obsolete. I guess I like bits of visual language that come from like a past that would have been the present from my grandparents' generation, so that parts of it are, like that the form is familiar, but the content is off, it's skewed or just, obsolete or outmoded. I find myself very much drawn to that kind of imagery where it belongs to an era that's over, and we are just kind of looking at it from where we are, saying, wow, what were those people like? What was their world like that they produced these sorts of images and circulated them among themselves?
So Todd, one of my favorites, if you could bring up Three Nuns Command.
Oh,
I love that piece. So I like typography.
I love typography. I'm pretty obsessed with it.
So this one I was drawn to immediately when I was perusing your website. I was like, oh, I like this a lot. So talk about this one and how this came about.
Well, yes. So the back, I do collect a lot of sort of exotic paper. What this page is on is actually decorative paper from Argentina that I just found there in a sort of a 60s decor fragment. What I did after that was I laid down strips of colored paper. You see a lot of pink, a lot of blue, almost like Post-it, kind of Post-its cut up. And then once I'd kind of half covered the surface, I then began to cut up words and phrases that again seemed hard to understand, that were sort of a little bit off target in terms of timing. So none of these phrases, with a few exceptions, none of these phrases make any sense to me at all. And that's one of the reasons I kind of like them. I felt like it was a sort of found concrete poetry, like a little bit like kitchen magnets, where you're just sort of arranging words. But at the same time, I'm also trying to shoehorn them in. I'm trying to make it so that the words have an overwhelming physical presence before you can distinguish each individual word in terms of its sense or its meaning. Yeah, I these are from everywhere. I just, wind up cutting up, phrases and words where I like typography, where I'm interested in sort of like these vintage forms of typography. And this is pretty representative. I can't do very many of these because it takes a long time to actually accumulate enough material, to start on a new one. So I think I have two of these sort of larger collages. And one of them was in my show last summer and was actually sold to a collector, which it was called Lucky Friday. And this is a little bit along those lines, but somewhat more ambitious. But again, I like these sort of like phrases that pop out and that sort of belong to a sort of soft sell phase of marketing that's a little bit less aggressive than what we're used to in terms of salesmanship. And also there were a series of books that were made for kids in the 30s and 40s, Tales of Wonder. I think it was sort of about using illustrated science books to teach kids about nature and sort of scientific tricks that they could use and experiments. So a lot of these, Why Does a Pop Gun Go Pop? The Queen Who Gave Up Her Boy, When Did You Last See Your Father? These are from young adult or children's literature. Kate Barlas of The Broken Arm, What Kind of Pump Is That? These all comes from children's literature from, say, 75, 80 years ago.
Yeah, this is really cool. You just kind of get lost in all the words and like trying to find meaning. And I love the fact that, Three Nuns command just pops right out at you. Even, once I saw the name of it, it's just like, I was like, oh, I wonder where that's at. And it's like, boom, right there. Of course it's centered, but I don't know. This thing just really appeals to me.
Well,
so
you can just sort of pick it up and keep reading. Three Nuns command a convenient box for knives and forks, your federation, some of the things which may have been made possible by it, the party on the boat, shake. I don't know. It's just, you can just read them. It's very, it adapts itself to almost any reading you want to apply to it.
So when you're done making the collage, what do you put some kind of shellac or over the top of it to?
I don't. Maybe I should, but I usually use enough gel medium underneath it that I don't know. I mean, I will occasionally put a very, very diluted gel medium, like just a wash over it and let it dry. But more often I don't. More often I just leave it. And I'll put it in a frame. That's the thing for me, is when it's done, then it can go in a frame and then hang on the wall. And then I can sort of relate to it as an object as opposed to something I'm working on.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. It's
Thank
fun.
you.
Yeah. I could get lost. It's one of those things where, you start looking at it and it really does. It draws you in, and then you find yourself 5, 10, 15 minutes later, like still reading
it.
Right.
Well, I hate to say it, but I have done more on this one as well. I've managed to shoehorn in about another 15 or 20 words.
Wow.
Since I took this photograph.
That's awesome.
Well, because I'm not quite ready to start one. And I like the idea of the words just reaching maximum density. It's just an effect I'm trying to achieve. And so more.
Yeah. Wes, is there any other pieces that you saw that?
Dry Gulch 2019.
That's another one that I liked too, Wes.
I really like this piece too.
The eye of the needle looks like it's from the Black Hills.
I think that is what it is.
Yeah, the Needles Highway. That's
Needles Highway.
Needles Highway. Yep. Yeah. That's exactly what that is. I took that trip. I took, among other things, I've always been an obsessive postcard collector. So there's a certain point where, there were the postcards to keep, and then there were postcards that could be cut up. And this one ended up in that. But yeah, I mean, this one was mostly put together through textures and colors. I was trying to find these overlaps, but I liked the idea of, these sort of accumulations of skulls, that when you travel through the West, you always see these references to ghost towns and abandoned mines and sort of all this mythology of a place that was once thriving, that's now, a desert. And that was obviously appealing to me in putting it together. But, I got to say, a lot of this stuff happens unconsciously. I'm putting things together based more on shape and form and color. And then after it's all put together, I step back and say, oh, okay, well, that's sort of obvious now, even though it wasn't when I was putting it together. And this is one of those where I'm just finding these sort of motifs running through it that I don't really think I was consciously aware of connecting at the time. I was just trying to make the composition work.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, Dan, what does it mean to you to be an artist? What does it take to be a successful artist?
Wow, I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are successful artists, but I think that for artists, most artists want everyone to be artists. I mean, I think there's a level in which, sure, there's competition professionally. People want to do well, with their career. But beyond that, artists are super open and accepting. And one of the things that I've come across is that no artist that I know has any issue with me making art at the moment. In fact, they all tease me because they're like, you're experiencing imposter syndrome when you think about maybe you shouldn't be making art, or maybe you shouldn't be showing your art, or maybe you should use a different name other than your own. All of that is this imposter syndrome. And all artists can relate to that. Every artist I've spoken to basically said, you're going through what we go through. It's like, maybe you don't go through it with your exhibitions, but you're doing it with your own artwork. And that's just what goes along with making this commitment in the first place.
So of your friends that are successful artists, is there something that you see in them that they do that sets them apart from, say, other artists? And we're talking, I guess, maybe the upper echelon of artists, but what does that boil down to? Is it just doing the work, being a hard worker, discipline?
I think it always involves pushing one step beyond what's already possible. I mean, I think the most successful artists are the ones that really try to break through a wall in terms of their field. They're either trying a new combination of materials, they're looking for different imagery, they're fusing the meaning and the form in a new way. I think artists are sort of obsessed with that which has not yet been created. And so they keep creating it in order to get to that next point, the thing that doesn't exist. I've always felt that that's related to how we adapt as animals to our environment. That we always have to be able, for survival, to understand what's new and what's unexpected or strange, and figure it out in a way that allows us to sort of learn from our environment and grow, and either avoid danger or feed ourselves better, or that this constant connection to the unexpected or the surprising is what got us here. I think it's what enabled us to evolve. And the more that we do that, the more that we expose ourselves to the unexpected, to the new and the strange and the bizarre, the better we adapt, the better equipped we are for facing these kinds of unknowns in the future, because the acceleration of change it's a reality now. We're just, the whole world changes inside out every 4 or 5 years, it seems, and that's not going away. It's not slowing down. And so I feel like the most successful artists have found a way to push our adaptability one extra step, towards a future, towards an unknown future, or an unknowable future, to be more specific. And I think that's why they're successful. They literally pull us from one stage in our development to another stage in our development. And we see that, we experience it in real time, and we reward them for it, in one form or another, by saying, like, wow, I don't know if I could have done that without your art. I mean, Andy Warhol is a perfect example of an artist who completely changed society through his work. And so much of the way we think about who we are as a culture, I think comes from his approach, from the way he articulated what he was doing, how he made certain predictions, how some of his aphorisms are kind of sort of a law now of nature, like everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. All of those ideas are now baked into our society, but they wouldn't have existed had Andy Warhol not come up with them in the first place. And I think you can look at Warhol and like Einstein, in a similar way. Once that new way of thinking is broached, you can't go back. You can't unknow this thing that you now know. It's now part of your new reconstructed reality. And in my experience, artists are fundamental in terms of preparing us for what we're about to experience.
That's so well put. I love that. Oh my God. So concise. Thanks. And just like right on the money. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you guys are recording this because I don't know if I've written it down quite that well. So I'll have to just do a transcript and
there you go. There we go. We'll just do that. You bet. So in that same vein, Basquiat, do you think he pushed the limit, or do you think he was a product of Warhol? What do you think made him such a lasting?
Oh no, he was the most important painter in the United States during his lifetime. No, he radically transformed contemporary art. I think his connection to Warhol was circumstantial. I mean, they collaborated a bit. They were pals. There was a tight friendship for a while, but they both moved on. And I don't think, besides the things that they collaborated on, I don't think they had much of an impact on each other's life. But Basquiat, in a decade when American art was all about expressionist based painting, where everything was supposed to be coming from the zeitgeist and the angst of the time. We had Julian Schnabel, we had all of these very, very well equipped and successful painters, and Basquiat is head and shoulders above all of them.
So who's doing that today, contemporarily?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Is it the Damien Hirst that because his name is everywhere. Is it David Hockney? Of course, he's kind of in that Andy Warhol period, I believe. Or
yeah, I wouldn't name either one of those. I mean, I think that Damien Hirst had his moment, and that it's past, and that his contribution, such as it is, has already come and gone. Okay. I mean, Hockney is a living master. That's a little bit different because it doesn't quite matter how innovative he is, because he's just such an incredibly good painter that that sort of makes up for a lot of other things. I think that for me, the artists that are the most interesting are those that are working with virtual reality and able to deal with virtual reality, where they're able to create synthetic worlds that you may need, an ocular device to be able to perceive. There's one artist who I'm really particularly fond of right now named Federico Solimi, Solmi. He's a video animation artist, but he builds his animation architecture on video game architecture. So the way that shapes are modeled and the way you move through space in video games, he's adapted that to his own animations. And so he's able to create these elaborate worlds where, even though in the video he takes you through it, you're watching a video, sort of like a camera movement, quote unquote, that he's controlling. He's also now evolved to making those same environments where you put on a visual reality viewer, and you step into those worlds yourself. You walk around with these structures that you previously only could see by looking at a screen or by looking at multiple wraparound screens, which is how it's usually experienced passively. And so I guess I feel like artists that are able to forge ahead into this new idea of what the visual is, what visual experience entails. Laurie Anderson, by the way, is one of the real pioneers in this area. She has not one, but two major virtual reality projects at MassMocha in North Adams, Massachusetts, that really must be seen to be believed, because they're both masterpieces. And it doesn't surprise me that, an artist who's been active in visual art, she's been active in music, she's done all this other performance-based work in video, now she's sort of able to step into virtual reality and do something that's really pioneering with it. So I wouldn't say that that there's like one name. I don't think we're in a moment right now where one singular artist is going to capture the imagination of the entire art world, because we're just too pluralist right now. We're just too stylized. We're not about styles and genres at this point in time. We're really about a sort of a broad framework in which all kinds of things can happen at the same time. But for me, this kind of merge into sort of new visual technology is I find it thrilling.
I was just going to ask you that, if you thought that this stage is exciting.
Oh, yeah. No, it's really exciting, because it's really the early years. It's really, a time when new frontiers are being broken. And I think the artists who've been sort of laboring in this field for a long time with no recognition, digital artists are sort of coming into their own right now, because they're seeing that their vision can be adapted to these new frameworks.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I probably won't live long enough to see the true progression of this form, because like right now, when I see a lot of the stuff that I see, like that are NFTs or whatever related, are really simplistic, but the technology is only going to get, as always, is going to get faster and more powerful. And I can't even imagine what's going to happen, let's say 30, 40 years from now.
Well, I think the technology is there. And I know that a colleague of mine, a guy named Daniel Birnbaum, who used to run the Modern Museum in Stockholm in Sweden, he left the museum field in order to start an agency, which I believe is Stockholm based, but it might be London based. And the agency exists for no other reason other than to commission artists who are already accomplished in their area, to commission them to do virtual reality works. Because his belief, his business plan is based on the idea that, these sort of headsets and virtual reality, the way we kind of navigate that is going to become much more of a lingua franca in the next several years, that it's going to be something that people are going to be increasingly comfortable with, that you can stay home and put a headset on and experience art that way. I agree that this is all changing right now, and I'm not entirely sure that I am convinced that NFTs have much of a role to play in all that. I think they're a bit of a distraction right now, but I do think the real innovative work is happening. Not the real innovative work, but there is a great deal of innovation and important innovation that's happening in the field of virtual reality.
Yeah.
I'm glad you spoke to the whole NFT thing, because I was going to ask you that question and how you felt about it. If you think it's something that's going to stick around, or if it's just a flash in the pan. I mean, it's early to tell, but for me, and we've had multiple discussions about it, I have a really hard time wrapping my head around the whole NFT thing.
I mean, I do too. I think that the role that the blockchain plays in terms of minting NFTs is a little bit above my pay grade. But I know artists who are working in the field, and Bitform's gallery in New York is the most important digital art gallery in the world. And it's the perfect example of a business that was floundering. I mean, they were just showing great art, but it was too ahead of its time. And now that NFTs have come along, the owner, Steve Sachs, is just like, yay. I've had 15 years of, just barely being able to keep body and soul together. And now the whole world is at my doorstep asking me like how to be an intermediary, how to function in the world of NFTs. And I mean, he feels a little bit the way about it that I do, which is that, if there are a lot of people who want to get into the field who aren't interested in art, but they want to make art related NFTs because it's the NFT part of it that's attractive to them. And that's the dead end. That's the dead zone of production right now. And I think people that are kind of more interested in seeing how artists themselves will slowly find a way to make work within these framework, I think that's where the future exists. But those artists have already been around working. They've been kind of in the digital art field, not knowing how to market their work. Because go back to the original problem. If you make a video, it's effectively a DVD, which means you can say, oh, it's an edition of 5, and I'm going to sell this to you for $50,000, and I'm going to recoup my $250,000 investment by doing that. Well, that doesn't work if somebody can just take that DVD and make 5,000 copies of it and spread it out for free in all the world. So that's the problem that NFTs came around to solve. I'm not sure how much of a solution they are. I think maybe in the end, they're just going to cause more problems. It's going to be like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. But meanwhile, for those video artists I know who were struggling, I do think it's been kind of a godsend, because I'm seeing artists who were broke for 30 years finally making some money.
Yeah.
I want to talk about a piece that you recently posted on your Instagram, which I thought was really interesting. It was compelling and surprising at the same time. Where did you see this at?
Well, this is at a gallery on the Lower East Side called Foxy Production, who work with a lot of mostly emerging artists, some mid-career artists as well. And the work is by Petra Courtwright. It's a digital painting. And what she's essentially done is used paint tools, digital paint tools, to create all of these marks. Some of the background is adapted from an early painting by Henri Matisse. But the rest are either photographic elements of these flowers. These 3 blooms appear in different configurations in all the works of the show. But she's managed to create an illusion, a really convincing illusion of texture, of the actual material presence of the paint, even though there isn't any. I walked into the show and I sort of, scanned, because now you scan a QVR code and to get the checklist. And it wasn't until I got to the 3rd painting that I looked and I went, wait a minute, that's not a brushstroke. That's a picture of a brushstroke. And then the whole process kind of changed, where first I was a little bit miffed. And then I thought, well, wait, what is going on here? This is actually kind of fascinating that somebody can print a photographic image incorporating all of these digital paint strokes, but do it on Belgian linen, no less, to make it look absolutely convincing, that you actually have to get about an inch away before your eye can discern the difference between the physical brushstroke and this sort of digital presence of it. So I love it that an artist is going to this extreme to try to imitate the look and feel of a quote unquote traditional, Fauvist or post-impressionist painting, when in fact it's all as flat as a single sheet of paper.
It totally fooled me, because I was looking at the texture of the linen, and I truly thought it was painting. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting, until you started talking about it. And then I'm like, let me get in. Yeah, it's wonderful and interesting.
Yeah, the weave of the linen is perfectly integrated with the appearance of these non-existent or facsimile brushstrokes. I think it's ingenious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen more of this kind of work starting to be shown in different galleries here around Denver, and I think it's exciting. It's a whole different mindset take on things, I think.
Yeah, I think that people want that tactile relationship to paint. I think that we sort of respond to it viscerally. I mean, it's something that you can, if you were allowed to touch them, you would want to run your fingers over it, feel these textures. And of course, this isn't that, but she's giving people a version of that satisfaction. She's trying to appeal to that desire for real tactility. And I don't think it's a withholding. I don't think she's sort of like depriving us of it. I think she's finding a very interesting halfway point where you can have the texture and the illusion of the texture at the same time.
I mean, we're looking at on a computer screen of all things, and it has dimension. So, fooled me.
Well, yeah, no, then this is one of the more clever ones because of that Matissean background that I mentioned with those strokes, where as soon as I posted it, 2 or 3 painters said, I know the painting that she took that from. But of course, that doesn't really affect people's relationship. Appropriation is just one of those tools that all artists have now.
We talk about appropriation a lot, either culturally or art appropriation. And so it's kind of interesting because it's been around forever, but boy, some people get in a little bit of trouble.
Well, there is that, intellectual property,
right?
Those small things like copyright.
Right. Yeah. Those little things. Is it Susan Levine? I think it's Susan Levine that did After Evans Walker.
Sherry Levine.
That's the one I have the biggest problem with. And then when I was reading it, it's like, I can't afford an Evans Walker, so I created my own. I was like, oh my God, but still you're selling it. That one's the one because there's no visually any difference.
No, visually there is no difference. I mean, she makes them using a cop stand. So she's trying to make the copy as close to the original as possible. I really love that work. I really think that Sherry Levine's early photographs are just great. And she also did watercolors, by the way. She made watercolors based on art book reproductions of artist work. So Mondrian, Miro, she did them all. That's the body of her work that really appeals to me the most.
Yeah.
Because as she liked to say, there's the original, there's my copy, and then there's something in between. And it's that something in between that she's after.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. So anyway, what's your, when it comes down, like where the rubber hits the road, what's your thoughts on art appropriation?
Again, I said it, I think it was just like a tool in artist toolboxes today. I think that the steam ran out of the appropriation movement pretty fast. I mean, I think that, Sherry Levine's work isn't as interesting as it was. I think you have people like Richard Prince who have been playing cat and mouse with sort of original creators who he then, takes their work wholesale from, sort of inviting a lawsuit over copyright infringement. I mean, I think that's a weird and kind of unpleasant sideshow to the more serious problems that were brought up by appropriation, which is that, what is the meaning of originality? What is, how much is the artist's creative act involved in making something absolutely new? When you make a copy of something, instead, what kind of a statement is that? And I think for Levine, it wasn't so much about making something that was affordable, but to say that, that her creative act is to copy and to acknowledge the source of what she's copying. So after Walker Evans becomes literally, I saw Walker Evans and this is the Walker Evans I saw and I'm making it now. It's still Walker Evans, but it's mine now. And it sounds silly, but it was actually a gesture that reverberated for a long time. And, like you said, it goes back to the entire history of art. And certainly someone like Marcel Duchamp in the early 20th century was appropriating like mad from every source that he could. But I think it took, the pictures artists of the late 70s to really make appropriation the main event, where there was really nothing else going on, but you faced with this perplexing situation of like, am I looking at a Walker Evans or am I looking at Sherry Levine? That was sort of the moment when the movement gelled, let's say. And then after that, it kind of spun off in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that, because I'm always fascinated by it. It's a subject matter that just always, as Todd will attest, always fascinates me.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with Clara Yanez, the mother, going back to Contui and the Blue Chapel, as someone who's worked with her hands all of her life and always dealt with representation. She had a bone to pick about conceptual art. She just said, I don't understand this conceptual art. What is it? It seems very cold to me and calculating, and why? And so I told her the story of how John Lennon met Yoko Ono at her opening in London. And she had that, famous piece where she puts a ladder in the center of the room, and you have to climb up to the ladder, and there's a little note taped to the ceiling that says, "Look at the stars." And the story goes that Lennon showed up, didn't know what he was going to. He was friends with the dealer. He climbed the ladder, looked at the note, came down and said, "I have to meet this artist." And that was how one of the great love stories of the 20th century happened. And so I wound up telling that story to Clara, sort of saying, well, here's an example of conceptual art where all the artist did was put a ladder in the middle of the room and wrote some instructions on a piece of paper and stuck the paper to the ceiling. Now, is that art? Is it conceptual art? What is it? What is it? What does it consist of? And, we spent about 2 hours debating that. And I like those kinds of examples because it doesn't really matter. You're not trying to prove something is wrong or right. You're just trying to get people to have that discussion, sort of engage in those ideas dynamically.
Yeah. You don't have to like it, but at least you're thinking about it. Right. And you're thinking things in a different way. And those
art isn't there for you to like it.
But that's what we think when we're looking at it, where I'm supposed to like it.
No. Sorry, fellas.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this journey has been interesting for us because we have learned so much. It's been such a great education because one thing that you do go in thinking is what you exactly kind of hit on is that you think that that you have to like everything. And that's just not true. There's some things that you're just never going to like. And that's fine. It's fine not to like art. It's fine to like art. And sometimes things that you like when you initially see them, later on down the road, you're like, yeah, maybe I don't like that quite as much as I thought I did. Or vice versa, right? You see something
vice versa happens a lot.
Yeah. Like, I don't really get that. And I'm not sure I like it. I mean, it's happened to Wes and I numerous times where we'll go look at something and we're like, I don't know about that. And then we revisit it or we engage with the artist and we kind of hear the thought behind it or the experience behind it. And it becomes something completely different. And then you stand in front of it again and you have a whole different appreciation for what's going on, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would go even a little further and say that I think the point of art is that you not forget it. I mean, there's the experience you have when you're looking at it, which is crucial. I mean, there's no substitute for that primary experience. But then it's what happens in your mind after you leave, like an hour later, a day later, a week later. And a lot of the things that you think are pleasant or pretty, or nice, that you try to remember them a day or two later and they're gone. They're a blank. But it's that thing that got stuck in your craw or that thing that sort of just irked you in a certain way. And you're still thinking about it 2 weeks later, and you're kind of going, I still don't get it, but I can't shake it. I can't get it off my mind. That's art doing its job. That's art doing what it's supposed to do, which is like finding its way into your consciousness and then sort of affecting change, sort of like I represent change. And as your mind is adapting to me, you're experiencing that same change. And then usually you go back to the artwork and it's like, oh my God, it's like an old friend. I miss you. I've been thinking about you all this time, and now we get back together again. I mean, it's really funny how that subjective experience just defines your experience over time.
Yeah. The other thing that I found interesting, and I won't bore with the whole story, but Mondrian, he did the one piece, but the line doesn't get to the edge of the canvas. Like most of the other lines are off the edge of the canvas, but there's one that it gets like right to the edge and it doesn't go off. And I spent some time with it because I used to hate it. But then I started looking at it. I was like, that is genius in a sense that every 99% of the other people would have just like finished the line, but he stopped it right there. Why? I don't know. But it was just like at that moment, I was like, oh my God, that is That's genius. I would have never thought of that. So it's kind of fun experiencing that too, like something like, or just a tick mark of red somewhere, or a complementary color of something. You're like, that sets everything up. That makes it work.
Yeah, Mondrian's a real sleeper that way. I mean, if you follow his development from like painting trees to painting abstractions and realizing that he was using the same compositional format all the way through it. It's just that the trees slowly turned into right angles and lines and you know, it's pretty amazing how subtle he is. But no, he's the best sleeper artist, because his paintings will sneak up on you over time, and then, you know, like when you least expect it, you're like, oh my God, that's beautiful. And the last time you saw it, you were just confused.
I was raging against the machine when I first saw it. Like, that is an art. That is an art. Him and Pollock. That is an art. Yeah, I totally did a 180 during the course of this podcast. That's the thing, you know, in the last 2 years.
While you were doing the podcast.
Well, yeah, through the whole process of this podcast, it happened fairly early, but it was a conversation with a number of people. And then you just kind of like, oh, let me sit back, you know, let me think about this. And you're like, oh shit, I never thought about it this way. And
I always find if people hate Pollock, the best way to get them to maybe change their minds or to look at it differently is to bring up Thomas Hart Benton, because, you know, not only was Benton his most influential teacher until he met the Mexican muralist, but you can see the influence. I mean, Pollock appears in some of Benton's paintings as a model, but then the composition, the swirls, come directly from the hills of Thomas Hart Benton. I've enjoyed having this conversation with Midwesterners, especially because they all love Thomas Hart Benton. But then if you say, well, how can you like Benton and not like Pollock? That always gets them. It always gets their knickers in a twist.
Oh, we love when people's knickers get in a twist, don't we?
Don't we though?
Oh my God, this has been fun.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
We'll start to wrap this up, but you've done a fair amount of writing. What publications do you write for on a regular basis?
Well, right now I write a lot for the Brooklyn Rail. The Brooklyn Rail is a free monthly publication out of Brooklyn, and it balances art criticism with poetry and politics. It's basically those three areas. And I like them because everybody reads it. It's like the Village Voice of the art world. It's, you know, something you read, and again, because it's free, it gets easily distributed. And I feel like it performs a service, you know, for the art community. There aren't a lot of periodicals right now. I mean, and the relationship between the magazines that were dominant in the past, like Art Forum or Art News, their relationship to their readership and their relationship to their writers is very, very different. And so people doing the kind of writing I'm doing are drifting or have drifted more to online publications. So the Brooklyn Rail, besides being a freebie that's set up all through kind of artist and gallery neighborhoods, is also prominent online. And I've just started working for their competitor, Hyperallergic, which is a New York publication. But most of the time, most of my writing projects are one-off. Most of them are for museums or galleries that approach me and say, "We're publishing such and such. Would you be interested?"
Gotcha. So mostly catalogs of an exhibition. Is that what you're contributing
Catalogs
to?
and books. Yeah, I just published my first book last year on Nicole Eisenman. And I have a book coming out about 6 months' time on Rizzoli about the Brazilian artist, Adriana Varejão. And I love the opportunity to, you know, be a contributor to a generally distributed book, because then it just winds up on people's coffee tables, or at least that it gets kind of like out there in a way that digital publications necessarily won't.
Is it hard to write about art?
Yeah, it's not easy because, you know, you're trying to write about something ephemeral, or not ephemeral. You're trying to write about something that's hard to pin down. So, you know, you find yourself having to switch from creating a sort of a cultural political context for the work, or putting the work in its period or a generation, and then talking about an individual work or how a certain series operates. I found that you have to switch from analysis to subjective description of subjective reactions, and then go back and forth. So I find it's hard going. It's not that it's hard in the sense that you run out of things to write about, because every artist is different. But I find I have to really think. I have to work hard to come up with an approach that's fresh for each artist that I'm writing about. And you're trying to write to that artist themselves. You're trying to say to that artist, I get what you're doing, and this is how I interpret it. But you're also trying to convince a reader. So I try to write at a level where a general reader could pick it up and just sort of start reading it and not feel like they're drowning in jargon. And that's not always easy. That's a tough balance to create, because you want it to be smart, but you don't want it to be
over the average person's head, right?
Yeah, you don't want to be pedantic.
Yeah.
I think art lends itself to that. Art lends itself to this sort of puffery, like people talking about wines, or opera. It's just you can get into silly language very quickly, and I think it's important to sort of sidestep that.
Yeah, I could see that being incredibly difficult, and even just the stuff that we do in trying to promote art and talk about art from the people that we interview. I find it difficult. How to describe, how to explain, how to make it so that people want to look and read what it's about. But I can't imagine what you do, or say Jerry Saltz, like trying to, write a piece that anybody can read and get what you're trying to convey. That seems incredibly difficult to me. And there was a very interesting essay or piece article that you wrote for the Brooklyn Rail. And this is from September 2019, entitled "I Was Wrong."
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was really well written and really interesting. And it kind of goes back to what you initially said when I asked this question, but I just want to read this first paragraph. It says, "Everyone likes to be proven right more times than not, but curators and art critics, because they occupy the front lines when it comes to shaping public consensus about an artist's exhibition or related phenomenon, have a correspondingly disproportionate investment in the rightness of their opinions. Over time, I found this to be a paradoxical situation, since being on the front lines requires one to make judgments on the spot or very shortly thereafter about developments that can't reasonably be expected to seem fully coherent until many years later. So how is it advisable or even possible to issue a bulletproof opinion on a subject whose most self-evident characteristic is that its historical destiny cannot be predicted?" That pretty much sums it up right there. This is a great article, by the way, or great essay, Thanks. I should say. And not a fan of Julian Schnabel?
Me?
Yeah.
No. No, I like his third movie very much. His third and fourth films, I think, are both very good. Mm-hmm. But no, I've never been much of a fan of the paintings or the sculpture.
Did you see his documentary about him?
No.
Oh, okay. There's a documentary about him. I thought it was kind of interesting, and I didn't know really his work in art. I knew his movies, but I didn't know that he was much of an artist. But yeah, so.
But I there's the fact that I don't care for Julian Schnabel's work. And then there's also the fact that because of his sort of exalted position in the art world, I feel not just validated, but almost obligated to put him down. I mean, that no one can occupy that position securely, and that therefore the more in awe people are of his stature, I think the more incumbent it is upon writers like me to just sort of say, that's ridiculous. The man is a mediocrity, and just sort of push that line partly because I believe in it, but also because I think that we have to be able to say the emperor has no clothes. That's a fundamental obligation of being a critic, to be able to say these things in public and have people say, "Oh my God, you just said that out loud. I can't believe you said that." And that's
it's a
that's why I
responsibility,
said
right?
it. It's a responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel the same way. And it was interesting, how you laid this all out. And I'll post a link to it in the episode notes so people can actually read this essay. Have you seen Dennis Scholl's Clifford Still documentary, Lifeline? Have you watched that?
No. Dennis Scholl made a documentary about Clifford Still?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to see that. No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
Really good.
It is really good. And there's a part in there where Clifford Still is actually interacting with Julian Schnabel, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have to go back and it's sticking in my mind. So this is why I mention it. Now it'll be some kind of fabrication that I dreamed or something.
It'll be something, totally made
But
up.
anyway, if I remember correctly, he was actually kind of talking about how interesting he thought Julian Schnabel's work was. And obviously this is towards the end of Clifford Still's life. But yeah, that just kind of popped in my head. But
I don't remember that, but doesn't mean it wasn't there.
I've never been a real fan of Julian Schnabel's paintings. They don't grab me. They don't knock my socks off. But anyway, I'm glad somebody else feels the same way. But more power to him, Before we leave off, I want to talk about the show that you curated for our good friend Dan Drossman. And we kind of got into it before we started in on this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what the show is about. And for people that want to see it, it's at a place called the Waiting Room Gallery here in Denver. And it's called A Delicate Balance. Did you come up with that name?
Yeah, that was the original title for the show back in 2006. And yeah, it was my title because I felt that the title described my position in the midst of this quite accurately. Because on the one hand, I was their teacher. On the other hand, I was a curator. I was a museum curator at that time. And then on the third hand, I'm actually acting as a go-between for these MFA students to get their foot in the door at a blue chip Chelsea gallery. So the whole thing involved like wearing multiple hats at the same time and saying, on the one hand, I am trying to do my best as a teacher to support these students, but I know that the function of the market and the marketplace is something that I should also be able to establish a critical distance from. In other words, try to say, well, the market isn't the be all and the end all of your lives, even though I know that deep down inside, they believe it is. So A Delicate Balance was just sort of a reflection on, okay, this is going to be a little bit weird, but we're going to do it anyway. My story vis-a-vis this particular crew, is special insofar as on the third or fourth day of class, which was, it was every week, every Thursday morning, they announced that they were in open rebellion with the head of studies, with the dean, effectively, a department head, I should say, and that I could either sign on to their rebellion or I could, just represent the establishment. I mean, it was just like catnip in front of me. And it turned out it was all about their thesis show. And now this is kind of maybe too wonky for people that haven't been in art school, but they had to have their thesis exhibition, these graduate students, their graduating thesis in March, which was barely halfway through the semester and with 2 more months of work in their studios to go. And they had gone to the dean. They said, this isn't working. We've got to come up with something else. He said, this is the way it's always been. This is the way it's going to be. And they said, no, it's not. And we're going to get Dan Cameron to lead this uprising. And so they brought this to class. And I was just like, well, what are you guys proposing exactly? And they said, well, let's do another show somewhere else. Because I think they'd already done, or they were just about to do their thesis shows, and they were really ticked off about it. So the discussion came up where, I just said, well, where? Give me a where. And of course, the classroom is in Chelsea, the border of the Chelsea Gallery neighborhood. And they said, we want to have it in a nearby neighborhood. That's, that's where everyone goes to look at art. We want to have it in Chelsea. And I said, okay, what's the best gallery? What do you guys think is the absolute top gallery in Chelsea? And there was a kind of a, mumbling and discussion. Finally, they said, we think David's Werner is the gallery. And I said, well, why don't you nominate one of yourselves to get up right now, because we still have an hour left of class, just get them to walk over to Werner Gallery and tell them what we're up to and see what they say. And if you come back with a yes, then you can go back to the department head with your threats, whatever it is, and at least kind of get a budget, get something thrown together so this can actually happen. Because if he doesn't believe it's going to happen, he's not going to do anything about it. If he does think it's going to happen, he's going to want to get on board. And they picked the guy who looked most like a model. He looked like he was just cut out of like a sportswear outfit. Sorry, Ricky, if you're tuning in. And he walked over and came back 45 minutes later, and he said, they said yes, they want to do it. And it was just one of those weird things where the exact days that they had as a gap in their schedule were the days that were the most advantageous to the students. I think it was drop off the work on a Sunday, install the show on a Monday, open it Tuesday morning, and pull it all out on Friday. Just get it all out of there. And there were like 30 odd students. So it was, the most fun, of course, was putting that together, because everyone's just so thrilled to be at the David Werner Gallery, and at the same time, they're just not, falling all over themselves to measure the distances, precisely, and get everything hung and lit perfectly. It was great. They had the gallery crew just sort of standing around watching the MFA candidates just going nuts with the work. So what happened, I know I'm carrying this story out, but what happened after that was that the SVA said, well, why don't you just do that? Why don't we just drop the March show and we'll do this other show? Or there was an interim period, maybe of a year or two, where they continued to do both. But the students won the day in terms of the argument for, we're having our thesis exhibition in May, not in March. That's what they wanted, and that's what they got. And so every year that I was there, the rules of the game were, we can't do anything that any of the previous classes have done. So the Chelsea Gallery prototype was used, and we threw it out the window, and then we just did all kinds of things. Like at one point, they put the thesis show on the road and drove it from Kansas City to New Orleans to, I forget what to San Antonio. And then another year, they put it all in a suitcase and sent it to Korea. And then another year, we used like 12 galleries on the Lower East Side. And we kind of like fudged the rules there. So this class, the class of 2006 is the one I'm getting around to. They really turned everything upside down in terms of what my idea of what that class was going to be about, in terms of SVA's expectations of that class. And I would say that, it's now 16 years in the future. This is the class from which I know the most about them as individual professional artists now. Like, they're the ones who are the most likely to still be showing, to still be keeping a studio going, and really being part of the art world.
And so for people that want to go see this show at the waiting room, have you stayed pretty much in touch with the majority of these students over time?
I would say I've been in touch with about half a dozen of them.
Okay.
And what happens is, when you're working relationship, like I'm close with Ted Reederer, I'm close with Dylan Mortimer, and I'm following through them. They stay close with others. So very often, if I'm talking to them about something or another, the subject of the class of 2006 will come up. And, well, who do you hear from? And what are they doing? And where are they living now? And how are things going for them? So even when I'm not in touch firsthand, I generally have an idea of what's going on in people's lives. Like I was aware of what Dan was doing, but I can't exactly tell you how other than, through other people. And artists share studios. So sometimes you go to a studio of one artist and there's two other artists from the same class sharing a space with them somewhere in Greenpoint or Long Island City. And that's kind of standard. That's par for the course in the art world, where people's graduate school connections stay with them for the rest of their professional lives.
Whose work that you hadn't seen in a while were you excited about for this show when you saw how they've evolved?
That's a good question. I actually think that the paintings that Steven Bindernagel is doing right now are really strong. There's two of them in the show. I think that actually Ricky Sears' time landscapes are really strong. Jeffrey Beebe is someone whose work I've stayed in touch with closely. He has a few small drawings in the show. Actually, I haven't seen this checklist, so I was working from an older list. But I did chose a lot of the work online, and so I haven't seen it in person yet, although in a lot of cases it hasn't changed that much from what the artists were doing before. But this is one of Steven's paintings.
Yeah, I really liked this piece.
I do too. He was always really good at creating these textures and getting this kind of dry, stubbly surface. And he gets a lot of mileage out of these forms, these geometric shapes that look kind of humanoid.
Yeah. And this piece is called Desert Island. I was really impressed with, I think her name's Jill Alexander.
Yeah, these are wonderful.
And Dan said that this is completely different than the work she did when she was at SVA.
It is like night and day. There's no relationship to what she was doing before. And these were really a really pleasant surprise.
Of course, I really enjoyed Dylan Mortimer's piece. This, I had no idea. It was interesting to talk with Dylan. But when I first saw this, I thought it was like, it looked like something that you would see from like the Aborigines in Australia. That's what it reminded me of. Like some kind of
a sand painting.
Yeah. Some kind of Aboriginal art. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to hear him talk about, the thought behind this and his story with getting a lung transplant twice.
A double lung transplant twice.
Double lung transplant twice. Just an amazing story. But this piece, to see it up close and personal, is really phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw Dylan's work, he was making like bling, like kind of hip hop bling that had sort of Jesus kind of sloganeering. I can't remember some of them, but it was all like trying to use the language of hip hop self-adornment to push a Christian message. And, he got a lot of flack from other students, because, this is New York City and, we're living in a secular world and the art world is so cosmopolitan, sophisticated. Nobody's going to want to have anything to do with art that's promoting this Christian message. And Dylan's attitude was like, well, that's fine because I'm going back to Kansas City and I'm going to just make my art the way I want to make it. And when he began shifting more into addressing his own medical condition as a cystic fibrosis survivor and then transplant recipient, and then again transplant recipient, I felt that he was kind of staying in this idea of like slightly dangerous territory because, this is hard for a lot of people to cope with, the direct relationship to a life-threatening situation that almost killed him, and has returned to almost killed him, in multiple times, and that he's able to turn it into this iconography that's very it's spiritual in nature, but it also never loses the sort of viscosity of a medical treatment, like an IV bag or scabs or blood transfusion, all of this stuff. And he keeps it ambiguous. It's always just suggestive enough to slip away, that it's not really always what it appears to be, or that he's kind of got this little bit of deniability to it. That's one of the things that really fascinates me about the way Dylan makes his work, is you can see it in very different ways, and it sort of changes its meaning depending on what you bring to it.
Yeah, it's really spectacular, and it was a joy to sit down with him and talk about his journey and the thought behind all this. Dan, thank you so very much for spending the amount of time that you did with us this evening.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
I sincerely appreciate it. It was such a wonderful conversation, and I know how busy you are. Do you sleep at all? I mean, I got to ask you.
I do. I try to watch some TV too whenever I can, but that takes discipline,
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and talking with us, and especially because you just got back from a big trip. So I just can't thank you enough.
No, it's really been my pleasure. I'm actually doing a webinar tomorrow night about the Chiloé trip. I'm sort of doing a slideshow about the road trip, if you're interested in checking it out on Hyperallergic. But no, it's been great to talk to you, Todd, and you too, Wes. It's been a nice three-way exchange, I think.
Yeah, I really enjoyed myself, and I love your collage work. It's amazing. I can't wait to see more of it. I hope you continue to go down that road, and I'll look for. I would love to be in Chicago to see your show, but I don't know if that's going to happen. I do have a sister-in-law that lives near Chicago, so maybe
you see,
I might be able to pull this one off.
And did you say you're in South Dakota?
I'm in Rapid City, South Dakota.
Wow!
Yeah.
Wow! I miss the Black Hills.
It's
I gotta
beautiful.
Get back.
It's colder than heck today, but yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Check out Dan's website at dancameron.art and find him on Instagram at DJBC1956. If you're in Denver, you can catch the exhibition Dan curated for the Waiting Room Gallery, A Delicate Balance, through the 17th of March. You can find all the details at thewaitingroomgallery.com. And if you want to donate to Dan's GoFundMe for this Blue Chapel project in Chiloé, you can find the link on his Instagram or look for the link in this week's episode notes. For the Tenet Podcast, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown. Have a great week.